He pointed at her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. "Get away from this fire." Otis Bellwether's voice cut through the night air, loud enough for every man in camp to hear. "We don't feed strays." 32 pairs of eyes turned toward the woman standing at the edge of the firelight. She was thin, dangerously thin, her dress stiff with trail dust, her hands gripping a dented cooking pot like it was the last thing tethering her to this earth. Because maybe it was. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just looked at the trail boss and said, quietly enough that some of the men had to lean in to hear, "Give me one supper. If your crew doesn't want another one tomorrow, I'll be gone before the rooster crows." What happened next would change every single person at that fire. And if you'd been standing there that night, cold, hungry, and so tired your boots felt like iron, you'd have had to ask yourself the same question every one of those 32 men asked. What would I have done? Well, if this is your first time here, welcome. Stories like Lenora's are what we live for on this channel. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay down. If that speaks to you, hit subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss one. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this one moves you, a like goes a long way toward helping us find the next one worth telling. Let's go back to that fire. Well, the autumn of 1883 did not arrive gently in the Nebraska territory. It came like a creditor, cold, indifferent, and early. The grass along the creek beds had already gone brown by the middle of September, and the sky most evenings wore the particular shade of gray that old-timers called widow weather, though nobody seemed to remember anymore why they called it that. Lenora Whitcomb could have told them. She had been walking for 2 days when she first smelled the smoke from Red Willow cattle camp. Not desperate, panicked walking. The kind of walking a person does when they have already passed through desperate and come out the other side into something quieter and more dangerous. The kind where your legs just move because stopping feels like dying, and dying feels like giving someone the satisfaction. Her husband, Thomas, had died in June. A fever that moved fast and left nothing behind worth arguing over. The farm they had scratched out of the Nebraska clay over 7 years. 2 failed seasons, 1 good one, and then 3 more that were merely survivable, went to the bank inside of 3 months. The bank did not send a man with apologies. They sent a man with a document and a deadline, and the document said everything the man's face was too polite to. She had 1 pot, 1 card, handwritten in her mother's slanted cursive, so faded she no longer needed to read it, and somewhere between $35 and $40 worth of pride that refused, absolutely refused, to let her crawl back to her sister in Ohio and explain how the West had used her up and spat her out, so she walked toward the smoke. She did not have a plan. People in the particular variety of trouble Lenora was in rarely do. She had a skill. She had a pot. She had the smell of cattle and wood smoke pulling her forward like a rope someone had tied around her ribs. The camp materialized out of the dusk the way trail camps always do. Gradually, then all at once. First the sound of cattle shifting and lowing somewhere in the dark. Then voices. Then light. Then the smell of something burning that was supposed to be food. She stopped at the edge of what the firelight could reach and looked at what she was walking into. 32 men. Some eating, most just sitting the way men sit after 14 hours in a saddle, not resting exactly, just no longer moving. The chuck wagon stood to the left of the main fire with its drop-down work table extended, and behind it a heavy-set man in a stained canvas apron stood scraping something from the bottom of a cast-iron pot with the determined expression of a man trying not to acknowledge that supper had gone wrong. That was Otis Bellwether. Lenora watched him for a moment. She had cooked for farmhands. She had cooked for her father's threshing crew when she was 12 years old, feeding 18 men 3 times a day for 2 weeks. She knew what it looked like when a man was fighting his own cooking and losing. She took 1 step into the firelight. Several men looked up. A few looked away. One near the edge of the group, young, maybe 19, with trail dust still caked in the creases around his eyes, stared at her with the particular expression of someone trying to decide if what they were seeing was real. Otis turned. He had a face built for skepticism. Heavy brows, a jaw that looked like it had strong opinions about most things, and eyes that had developed, over years of camp cooking, the ability to assess a situation in about 2 seconds and find it lacking. He assessed Lenora in considerably less than that. "We don't run a charity operation." He said it before she had opened her mouth. before she had done anything except stand there. Said it loudly, too. The kind of loud that was less about making sure she heard and more about making sure everyone else did. Whatever you're selling or asking for, the answer's no. Move along. A few men shifted, not away from Lenora, just the small, uncomfortable shifting of people who have witnessed something and aren't sure yet whether to be bothered by it. Lenora didn't move. I'm not asking for charity. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, given that she had not eaten properly in 3 days, and her legs had begun that deep, bone-level trembling that she'd been ignoring for the last 6 miles. I'm asking for a chance to earn supper. Otis made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal. Lady, I've been cooking for trail crews for 11 years. I don't need— That's not cornbread. She nodded toward the pot he was holding. It's cornmeal that got frightened and gave up. And whatever's in that other pot has been going too long. You've got scorching on the bottom, and you're stirring it in, which means it'll taste like the outside of a fireplace. Complete silence. Not even the fire made noise for a moment. Or maybe it did, and nobody heard it. Otis stared at her with an expression that moved through several stages. Surprise, offense, and then, briefly, something that might have been uncertainty before he clamped back down on it. Ma'am. A different voice, deeper, quieter, with the particular flatness of a man who has learned that raising his voice is almost never the most efficient tool. What is it exactly you're proposing? Lenora turned toward the voice. Bram Coulter was not what she expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to explain what she had expected. He was somewhere north of 40, not tall, but built the way working men are built. Not for appearance, but for duration. He had the kind of face that had been weathered past handsome into something more interesting, with a jaw that needed attention and eyes that were currently doing something she'd seen in very few men's eyes, actually thinking before speaking. He was sitting slightly apart from the others, which she understood immediately was not aloofness but habit. The way a man responsible for 32 people learns, over time, to keep a little physical distance just so he can see the whole picture. I can cook, Lenora said, simply, without decoration. Better than what's coming out of that pot. Give me one supper. One. If your crew eats it and doesn't want another one tomorrow, I'll be gone before sunrise. I won't ask for a thing tonight except the ingredients and the fire. Bram looked at her for a long moment. She held the look. She was too tired and too hungry and too stripped down to pretend. Chester. Bram didn't raise his voice. A wiry man near the fire looked up. How long since we had a meal that didn't need apologizing for? Chester thought about it with the seriousness of a man being asked a genuine question. Dodge City, he said finally. That place with the blue door. That was August. Yes, sir. Bram looked back at Lenora. What do you need? Otis made a sound that was clearly intended to be the beginning of an objection, but something in Bram's posture made him swallow it and stand there with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his opinion radiating from every square inch of his frame. Lenora told Bram what she needed. She made the list short because she had assessed the situation the moment she walked in, and she knew what a trail camp in the middle of autumn was likely to have and not have. Poor flour. Salt pork that had been going since early summer, dried beans, wild onions, if anyone had bothered to pull them along the creek, and she had seen some 3 miles back, growing in a patch that most people would walk past without noticing. There were onions, said the young one, the 19-year-old with the dust around his eyes. He looked slightly startled to have spoken. Back where we watered the horses, I noticed them. I know. No, Lenora said. I passed them on the way here. Can someone ride back for them? The young man was already standing. His name, she would learn later, was Denny Pratt. 18, actually, not 19. He had been rounding up for the past 6 months because he thought it made him sound more hireable. He had left a farm in Missouri because his family had too many mouths and not enough everything else, and he had been on this drive since May, and the last time he had eaten something that tasted like something his mother might have made was so long ago he'd stopped thinking about it because thinking about it made him feel things a trail hand couldn't afford to feel. He rode back for those onions like his life depended on it. Lenora rolled up her sleeves. What happened over the next 2 hours was not magic. She would have been annoyed if anyone called it that. It was work, the specific, practiced, non-glamorous work of someone who had cooked for people with nothing and had learned that the difference between a bad meal and a decent one is almost never about the ingredients. It's about time and attention and knowing what you're asking each thing to do. The Dutch oven was damaged, a crack in the lid that she noticed immediately and that Otis had not mentioned, which explained several things. She packed the crack with a strip of canvas and wet clay from the nearby creek bank, which Otis watched with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not respect, not yet. But not contempt either. Something in between. The salt pork she cut thinner than most people would, against the grain rather than with it, and rendered it slow while she soaked the beans in the warmest water available. The flour she worked with her hands, checking for weevil damage. There was some. She discarded that portion without comment, and made a rough biscuit dough that she knew would not rise the way it should without proper leavening, but would at least be warm and fill the mouth with something that tasted like a meal rather than an obligation. The onions came back with Denny. He had pulled up everything in that patch, more than she'd asked for, his arms full of them, soil still clinging to the roots, looking almost proud in the tentative way of someone who is not sure yet whether they've done something useful or something foolish. "That's good," she told him, and meant it. He stood there for a second too long after that, which she noticed but didn't comment on. She chopped the onions by firelight, low to the blade, quick through the cut the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old, standing on a step stool in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke in summer. She added them to the pork fat and didn't rush them. Caramelizing onions is one of those things that cannot be hurried without destroying the point of them, and Lenora had learned patience long before she had learned cooking. Men started drifting closer to the fire. Not obviously, not in a group. One at a time, the way cats approach something interesting, pretending they're there for some other reason, pretending the smell isn't pulling them in like a hand around the back of their collar. Otis remained at the edge, arms crossed, watching. Bram remained where he'd been sitting, watching as well, but differently. He was watching the way he watched everything, not for entertainment, but for information. By the time the food was ready, the camp had rearranged itself around Lenora's fire without anyone having made a decision about it. They just ended up there. All 32 of them, closer to the warmth and the smell than they'd been to anything in months that wasn't work or weather. She served them herself, starting with the men who looked youngest and most worn, which Otis noted without commenting on. She made sure every plate had enough. She watched faces, not looking for compliments, but for information, adjusting the next portion based on what she saw in each man's posture and speed of eating. The biscuits were not perfect. She knew that and didn't pretend otherwise. The beans could have soaked longer. The pork could have been better quality pork. But the food was warm, and it was seasoned, and it had been paid attention to, and on a cattle drive in 1883, after 7 months on the trail, those three things together are indistinguishable from a miracle. 32 men ate in this concentrated silence of people who are genuinely, completely focused on what they're eating. Chester, the wiry man, looked up partway through and said, with the tone of someone making a factual observation rather than a compliment, "This tastes like something." "That's the standard?" Lenora asked. "On this drive?" "Yes, ma'am." When the plates were done, she cleared them and scoured them with creek sand the way she always had, moving efficiently in the firelight. And then she set the pot back on the edge of the fire to stay warm, and she stood at the work table and, Bram noticed this, she did not eat. He waited to see if she was waiting for something. She wasn't. She was simply cleaning up. "Ma'am." He walked over, unhurried. "Your plate." "The cook eats last." She said it the way someone says a rule they've held for so long it stopped feeling like a choice. "Whoever's left." "There's plenty left." There was. She had made sure of that. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and filled a plate, and she ate it standing at the work table with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who understands that food is fuel and sentiment about it is a luxury. Bram watched her eat 3 bites and then looked away. And something moved through his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one. He walked to where Otis was standing. "She hasn't eaten in a while," Bram said quietly. Otis said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a texture to it that it hadn't had earlier in the evening. "I noticed that. How many men in camp have eaten worse than that and tried to hold their head up?" Bram wasn't asking for an answer. "How many have you hired who couldn't stretch beans and bad flour into something that 32 men cleaned their plates for?" Otis looked at the fire. She packed that crack in my Dutch oven, he said finally. I've been fighting that pot for 6 weeks. The words that came after weren't the words Bram expected. Otis was not a man given to reversing himself. He had a reputation for it, for being the one fixed point of opinion in any discussion, stubborn the way a fence post is stubborn, rooted and unmovable and proud of it. But he turned to Bram with an expression that had shed most of its armor and said, "If she leaves, you might have to find a new cook, too." Bram looked at him. "I'm not joking," Otis said. "I'm not saying it to be dramatic. I'm saying she's better than me, and she knows things I don't know, and if this camp loses her tomorrow because of some fool rule about propriety, I am going to be genuinely put out about it for a long time." Bram turned back toward the fire. Lenora had finished eating. She was washing her own plate now, her back to both of them, and she had the posture of someone who has said what they came to say and is prepared, entirely prepared, for the answer to be no. He had met 1,000 people in his years running cattle. He had hired and fired and trusted and been wrong about all manner of men who seemed solid and turned out to be sand. He did not know this woman. He did not know her story. He knew that she could cook and that she was half-starved and that she had walked into a camp full of strangers without a weapon or a companion and had simply gotten to work, and that there was something in that combination of facts that he did not want to dismiss. He walked back toward Lenora. "Wages are $12 a month," he said. "There's a horse you can ride so you're not walking alongside the wagon. Meals are—" He paused, obviously covered. She turned around. "And you keep your own sleeping area, other side of the supply wagon. The men understand boundaries in this camp. The ones who don't figure it out on their own, I correct." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. $12, she said. 12. She nodded once. Not with relief, with the specific, controlled precision of someone accepting a fair arrangement, not a favor. "I'll need a better leavening agent than whatever's in that tin," she said. "And if there's any possibility of picking up dried peppers at the next town, I'd appreciate the consideration." Bram almost smiled. He stopped himself. But it was close. "I'll see what we can do." Around the fire, men were pulling out their bedrolls. The camp was settling into the particular quiet of a night that had gone better than expected. Someone near the back, she would never find out who, said something low that made 3 other men laugh. And it was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of men who have just been surprised by something and have decided to enjoy the feeling. Denny Pratt sat down near the fire's edge and looked into it with the expression of someone replaying something. When he noticed Lenora looking at him, he straightened up. "Those were good onions," he said. "They were," she agreed. He nodded, satisfied with this assessment, and pulled his blanket around his shoulders. Lenora stood at the chuck wagon and listened to the camp go quiet around her. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark, cattle shifted and breathed their slow, patient breath. The night was cold, but not cruel. Not yet. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the farm. She thought about the moment she had understood that the door was closed, and she was standing in open country with 1 pot and 1 card and enough stubbornness to be dangerous. She did not cry. She had done that. She was done with that part. She checked that the fire was safely banked, covered the remaining beans, and walked to the far side of the supply wagon where a bedroll had appeared, left without comment by someone she would thank in the morning. She lay down. She listened to 32 men breathe, and for the first time in 4 months, she slept without dreaming about closed doors. She was gone before most of the camp opened their eyes. Not gone from the drive, gone from her bedroll, gone from the supply wagon's shadow, gone from whatever small temporary privacy the night had offered her. By the time the sky had shifted from black to the particular dark blue that comes 20 minutes before a person can actually see anything, Lenora was already at the fire. She had rebuilt it from coals she'd banked the night before, which told Bram something when he woke at 5 and smelled coffee. Real coffee, not the scorched, gritty approximation that had been passing for it since August. He lay in his bedroll for a moment, not moving, just registering that smell and what it meant. And then he got up. She had found coffee beans in the bottom of a storage sack that Otis had either forgotten or given up on, and she had ground them between 2 flat stones because the camp's grinder was broken and apparently had been broken for the better part of 2 months, and nobody had mentioned it. She was straining the grounds through a folded piece of clean canvas when Bram walked over. He looked at the canvas. "Otis has a grinder," he said. Otis's grinder is in 4 pieces in the bottom of the tin box on the left side of the wagon. She poured him a cup without asking if he wanted one. I can fix it, but I'll need a few small things. I'll make a list. Bram drank the coffee. He stood there for a moment in the cold morning, steam rising from the cup, and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. The coffee was what coffee was supposed to be and hadn't been in longer than he cared to calculate. How long have you been up? He asked. Long enough? It was not an evasion. It was just the answer of someone who does not track time in terms of sleep, because sleep is not something they think of as a resource they're owed. He let it go. The men woke one by one and came to the fire with the cautious hopefulness of people who had experienced something good the night before and were not entirely sure it would still be there in the morning. It was. Lenora had made a thick cornmeal porridge with the last of the onions and a portion of the salt pork cut into thin pieces and crisped in the pan, laid over the top. It was not elaborate. It was hot, and it was filling, and it had been seasoned. And on a trail camp in October, those qualities together constitute a minor revolution. Chester ate 2 bowls without speaking and then said, to no one in particular, I'm going to be in a significantly better mood today. Several men laughed. Otis came to the fire last. He stood at the edge and looked at what was left in the pot, and then he looked at Lenora, who was washing the first round of bowls in the creek bucket, and he said roughly, the Dutch oven's still holding. Clay'll last 3 days if the fire doesn't get too hot on that side, she said, not looking up. I'll repack it when we make camp tonight. Otis picked up a bowl, filled it, sat down. That was Otis's version of a peace treaty, and everyone in camp understood it as such. They pulled out that morning with the herd moving well, the air cold enough to keep the cattle calm, and something different in the atmosphere of the camp that Bram could feel but could not have precisely named. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It wasn't morale in the way that word usually gets used. It was more like steadiness, the particular quality of a group of people who have something reliable at the center of their day. Lenora drove the chuck wagon. She had driven a wagon since she was 10 years old, and she handled this one with competence, not grace. She fought the left wheel for the first 2 miles before she figured out its particular stubbornness and adjusted for it. She did not ask for help. She adapted. Bram rode alongside her for a stretch around mid-morning, not for any stated reason. How far to the next water, she asked, which surprised him, because it was not a cook's question. It was a logistics question. 7 miles, give or take, creek that may or may not be running, had trouble there 2 years back. She nodded, looking at the trail ahead. If it's dry, the beans I'm soaking won't have enough water to finish. I'll need to adjust the ratio tonight, or people are eating half-cooked beans, which nobody wants. He looked at her sideways. You're thinking 7 miles ahead. I'm always thinking 7 miles ahead, she said. 7 miles back too, mostly. It's habit. He didn't push on that. There was something in the phrasing 7 miles back that had weight to it, the kind of weight that comes from a specific place. And he had learned over years of managing men that you don't pull at things with weight until you understand what's holding them up. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking and the herd a low rumble to the south. You know cattle, she said eventually. It wasn't a question. Know them well enough? What do they need that they're not getting? He looked at her again, more directly this time. Why? Because I'm driving behind 3,200 head of beef every day, and I'd like to understand what I'm living with. She kept her eyes on the trail. Also, calm cattle are quieter cattle, and quieter cattle let the men sleep, and men who sleep eat better and in a better frame of mind, which makes my job easier. Bram was quiet for a moment. Then he explained the particular temperament of this herd, a led steer named Augustus, who set the pace and whose mood was essentially contagious to the animals around him, a problem flank where 3 young steers had been bunching in ways that made the riders nervous. A tendency of the whole herd to spook left rather than right, which had caused 2 near disasters in stream crossings. I explained this the way he would have explained it to a trail hand, without simplifying it, because something about her posture indicated that she would notice if he simplified it and would find it condescending. She listened without interrupting, asked one question at the end about the bunching steers that was perceptive enough that it made him pause before answering. You sure you haven't worked cattle before? He asked. I haven't. But I've worked with things that have their own logic and their own needs and their own ways of going wrong if you don't pay attention to them. Turns out most of the questions are the same. By the time they reached the creek, running, thank the cold weather, running clear and well, Lenora had already mentally reorganized the evening meal and had given Denny Pratt, who had been riding drag and was therefore lowest on the camp's informal hierarchy, a specific task involving the water barrels that made him feel like he'd been assigned something important, which he had. Denny, Bram noticed, did it without being asked twice. The first real test came 11 days into the drive. Not the storm. That came later. The first test was quieter than a storm and more personal, the kind of test that doesn't look like a test until you're in the middle of it and realize the ground has gotten soft under your feet. Lenora had noticed, around the third day, that a rider named Cal Devers was not eating enough. Not dramatically not eating, not refusing food, not making a statement about it, just consistently leaving things on his plate that a man 16 hours in the saddle should have finished. She watched him for 2 days before she said anything, and what she said was not what any of the men expected. She added egg powder to his biscuits. Just his. She didn't announce it. She made a small separate portion every morning for 4 days, firmer than the others, easier to chew, and made sure it ended up in his hands. She had noticed that he favored his left jaw when he ate, the tiny wince he covered with a sideways turn of his head. On the fourth day, Cal came to her while she was prepping the evening meal and stood there a moment. "You're making those different," he said. "Different how?" It was not a question, and he knew it. He looked at his boots. "Got a bad tooth," he said. "Back left. Been bad since June. I know I need a dentist, He stopped. "We're a long way from a dentist." "You are," she agreed. She reached into the medicine box she'd reorganized on day 2. "Oil of cloves. Not a fix, but it'll take the edge off the worst of it. You've been chewing on the right side so long your neck is going to start hurting next." She handed him the small brown bottle. "Also, I need you to stop trying to eat the hard tack. I'll soak yours from now on. Don't make it a whole thing." Cal looked at the bottle, then at her. He was somewhere around 50, Lenora guessed, with a face that had been through a great deal and had developed the particular closed expression of someone who learned young that showing you were in pain was an invitation for people to use it against you. "Don't make it a whole thing," he repeated. "That's what I said." He put the bottle in his vest pocket. "Thank you, ma'am." "Eat your supper, Cal." He did. He ate the whole plate. Bram saw it. He didn't say anything to Lenora about it, but he filed it away with the other things he was filing. The way she fixed the grinder, the way she knew the creek was coming before anyone told her, the way she made sure the youngest hands got their food first without ever making it seem like a policy. The way she sat sometimes at the end of the night with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper and wrote down things that turned out, when he glanced at them once without meaning to be inventory calculations, 2 days ahead. His own bookkeeping was not that organized. The storm arrived on a Tuesday. It came from the northwest the way the bad ones do, with an afternoon sky that turned a color that isn't quite green and isn't quite yellow, but is its own particular shade that any plains person recognizes the same way they recognize the smell of a turned ankle right before it turns. Bram saw it and made decisions fast. Get the herd moving to lower ground, get the horses secured, get the camp organized. What happened to the supply situation during the storm was this. The canvas cover on the back of the chuck wagon, which had been patched and repatched and was holding together through a combination of wax and optimism, finally failed. It failed in the specific way of something that was already mostly gone, not dramatically, but completely. The wind took the back half, and the rain that followed was not polite about what it found. By the time the storm passed, 3 hours that lasted in the way that genuinely bad hours last, each one longer than the math would suggest, most of the flour was wet. A significant portion of the dried goods were water damaged. The sugar was completely gone, dissolved into a sticky paste at the bottom of the tin. The cornmeal was salvageable only in part, the part that had been in the sealed inner tin rather than the secondary bag. Lenora stood at the back of the wagon in the aftermath rain, holding the ruined canvas, doing mathematics in her head. Bram came up beside her. "How bad?" She told him. Not the emotional version, not the catastrophic version, the inventory version. Exactly what was gone, exactly what was salvageable, exactly what they could stretch, and for how long. Bram listened. He ran the same numbers in his own head as she talked and kept arriving at the same difficult place. "How far to the next supply stop?" 4 days if the herd moves well. She set down the canvas. 3.5 if we push, but the men will eat more if they're pushing, so that's not an improvement. Options. She looked at him, not with desperation, with the focused expression of someone who has already gotten to the other side of the panic part and is working the problem. I can stretch what we have if I change how I'm cooking. No waste at all. Every trim, every scrap goes back into the pot. I can make stock from the salt pork rinds that people have been throwing away, which, she paused, because she wanted to be accurate, I should have been doing already. I can cut the bread ration and add more bean volume, which the men won't like but won't hurt them. And if we hit any creek beds with good growth, I need someone to ride ahead and look. Cattail roots. Lamb's quarters if we're lucky. There's a kind of wild plum that sometimes grows along the lower creek banks this time of year, mostly dry by now, but the dried ones are still good. Bram looked at the damage, then at her. What do you need? I need Denny to stop throwing away the bread heels, she said. And I need whoever is responsible for those salt pork rinds to stop acting like they're garbage. Chester, Bram said. I figured. Tell Chester the rinds are spoken for from here on. Bram walked back toward the men, who were assessing various damages to equipment and bedding with the collective expression of a group that has been hit and is taking stock before deciding how to feel about it. Nobody touches the food scraps from here on, Bram announced. Bread heels, rinds, any of it. Lenora's got a use for it. A few men exchanged glances. Chester said, The rinds? The rinds. Chester made a face but nodded. What Lenora produced over the following 4 days was not what she would have chosen to make. She knew that and didn't pretend otherwise. She made a thick pork and cattail root soup on day 1 that was honestly better than she expected, the roots adding a substance that helped the reduced meat portions feel like less of a reduction. Day 2 was harder. She stretched the remaining cornmeal with dried grass seed that Denny found along a creek bed and which she'd seen her grandmother use once, 40 years ago in a story her mother told, and which worked well enough that 3 men asked what she'd done differently. Variation, she said, which was technically accurate. Day 3 was the hardest. She had bean soup, and she had biscuits that were thin and didn't rise, and she had the honesty to put them on the table without apology, because apologizing for food doesn't improve it, and men who are tired and hungry do not need the cook to perform distress on top of their own. She just put it on the table. Hector Vane, a rider in his mid-40s, who had been on the trail longer than most and had the quiet authority that comes from surviving things, ate his soup and his flat biscuit and said, My mother made bread like this when the mill was out. Mine too, Lenora said. Hers was better, he said, but there was no hostility in it. So was mine, she said, and several men laughed, and that was that. On day 4, they reached Stonebridge Crossing. Stonebridge Crossing was not much. A trading post, a water station, a cluster of permanent structures that had organized themselves into something resembling a small town, largely because the river crossing was there and travelers had to stop somewhere. It had a general store, a livery, a boarding house, and several buildings that served functions that the people inside them were tactful about advertising. It also had Constance Vale. Lenora heard the name before she saw the woman. Several riders mentioned it in the hour before they arrived, in the way that people mention things they want you to be prepared for without quite knowing how to do the preparing. There's a woman runs the merchant operation at the crossing, Chester said, riding alongside the chuck wagon as they approached. She's got opinions. Most people do, Lenora said, about women on cattle drives. Lenora kept her eyes on the trail. I've met that opinion before. What she had not quite was the specific social theater of it performed in front of a crowd. Constance Vale was somewhere between 55 and 60, dressed in the particular way of a woman in a frontier town who has decided that other people's standards do not apply to her, but has simultaneously decided that her standards are the ones that should apply to everyone else. She was not unattractive and she was not stupid, which made her more formidable than either of those things alone would have. She was standing outside the general store when the chuck wagon pulled up, and she looked at Lenora the way Lenora had been looked at before. The quick assessment, top to bottom, that takes in everything and assigns it a value the person being assessed doesn't get to challenge. You're Coulter's new cook, she said. I'm the camp cook, yes. Lenora set the brake on the wagon. Unattached widow, I'm told. She said it pleasantly, the way a person says something that they know functions as a weapon but are choosing to call an observation. Lenora climbed down from the wagon. 32 men in that camp, Constance continued, and she was saying it to the gathering group now, which included people from the trading post, a few travelers, and 3 of Bram's riders who had ridden in ahead of the wagon and were now watching with expressions ranging from discomfort to anger. A respectable outfit doesn't put a woman in that situation, and a respectable woman doesn't put herself there. There was a silence. Lenora was aware of the eyes on her. She was aware of Bram somewhere behind her, having heard the last of this as he rode in, pulling up his horse. She was aware of several men in her camp whose expressions had moved from discomfort into something harder. She was also aware, with the specific clarity that comes from having almost nothing left to lose, that she had been in this situation before. Not precisely this one, but the one where someone with a comfortable position decides that your situation is evidence of your character rather than evidence of your circumstances. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She looked at Constance Vale for a moment, steadily, and then she turned to Chester and said, "Is the store here the one carrying dried peppers, or do we need to check the trading post?" Chester, who had gone slightly red around the ears, said, "Store, I think." "Then let's get the supply list sorted," she said, and walked toward the general store door. It was such a complete non-engagement that it took Constance a moment to react, and by the time she did, the moment for the reaction had already passed. Bram dismounted. He walked past Constance Vale without stopping, which was its own kind of statement, and followed Lenora into the store. Inside, she was already at the counter, supply list out, talking to the store owner about flour quantities. She did not look up when Bram came in. He stood near the door for a moment. "You didn't have to walk away from that," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "Yes, I did." She turned a page on her list. Because the other option was making it into something, and making it into something gives it a life it doesn't deserve. She looked up at him briefly. "I've had worse." "That doesn't mean you should have to keep having it." She held his gaze for a second longer than was strictly conversational. Then she looked back at her list. 2 barrels of flour," she told the man behind the counter. "The better grade if you have it, and dried peppers if you've got them." Outside, the camp had reorganized itself around the supply wagon, with the particular efficiency of people who have a job to do and have decided the other available option, standing around watching a social confrontation, is less interesting. Denny Pratt had already started transferring the new supply sacks with the focused energy of someone who needed something to do with his hands. Otis came to find Lenora when she came back out. He fell into step beside her without preamble. "You know, most of the men in this camp would have said something back there." "I know. Some of them wanted to." "I know that too. Bram especially." He paused. "He doesn't like that kind of thing. Nobody who's decent likes it." She checked the flour sacks. But it wasn't his fight. Maybe he thought it was. Lenora set down the sack she was checking and looked at Otis directly. He had the expression of a man who is delivering information he has decided is important, uncomfortable with the delivering of it, but committed to it. "Otis." She said his name the way she said most things, not unkindly, not with distance, just clearly. "I appreciate what you're doing. I do. But I've been managing other people's opinions of me since I was old enough to have opinions, and I've got my own way of doing it. It's not the same as your way, and it's not the same as Bram's way, and I don't need rescuing from a woman with a sharp tongue and a wide audience." Otis looked at her. "Fair enough," he said. Then, after a pause, "The dried peppers come through?" "Half of what I wanted. Better than nothing." "Story of this drive," he said. They finished the resupply in 2 hours and pulled out before sunset, which put them behind the schedule Bram had wanted, but ahead of where they'd have been if the storm had done more damage. Lenora filed that balance in the same mental ledger where she kept all the other running calculations and kept moving. That night, making camp on the far side of the crossing, she made a meal that was genuinely better than anything she'd managed in the post-storm days. Proper flour now, dried peppers worked into the beans, real biscuits that rose the way they were supposed to, and a pan gravy that used the last of the stock she'd been building from scraps for 4 days. The stock had reduced and concentrated and turned into something that had actual depth to it, and when it hit the plates, the camp went quiet in the specific way that meant it was good. Hector Vane said, from his usual spot near the left edge of the fire, "That's different." 4 days of saving the rinds, Lenora said. He looked at his plate. "Chester's rinds?" "Chester's rinds. Chester, on the other side of the fire, made a face that was mostly theatrical and said, "You're welcome, I suppose." Laughter moved through the camp like warmth, easy and unforced, and Lenora stood at the work table and felt something she hadn't felt in so long it took her a moment to identify it. Not happiness, exactly. Something more fundamental than happiness. The sense of being in a place where the people around her were glad she was there. Not for what she represented or what she proved or what she had survived, but for what she actually did, every day, with her hands and her attention and her 12 years collected knowledge of how to make something from very little. She washed the plates. Bram passed behind her on his way to check the overnight riders, and he stopped for just a moment. He didn't say anything. He just stopped. "Good night, Bram," she said, without turning around. "Good night, Lenora," he said, and kept walking. It was the first time he'd used her name, she noticed. She didn't make anything of it. She finished the plates, checked the fire, covered the remaining food, and walked to her bedroll. The drive had another 3 weeks ahead of it. The river crossing that everyone was quietly worried about. The prairie that got drier and more unpredictable past the halfway point. The slow accumulation of miles that ground men down in ways that were never dramatic and always real. She knew all of this. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders and listened to the fire settle and the cattle breathe. And somewhere out in the dark, Augustus, the lead steer, moved with a low and steady sound that meant the herd was calm. She had learned to listen for that. She was, she realized, already thinking about tomorrow's meal. Already thinking 3 miles ahead and 7 miles back, the way she always did, the way she couldn't stop doing even when she tried. A battered cooking pot, a faded recipe card, and a stubbornness that she had spent most of her life being told was a flaw. Turns out it was the only tool she'd ever really needed. The river showed up 3 days earlier than anyone expected. Not because the maps were wrong, the maps were approximately right, the way maps in that part of the country were approximately right about most things, which is to say, they were useful until the moment they weren't. The problem was the rain that had fallen 200 miles north a week ago. Rain that nobody in the camp had experienced because it happened somewhere else to someone else's land. And that rain had found its way into the creek systems, and from the creek systems into the river. And by the time Red Willow outfit arrived at the crossing that Bram had used twice before without incident, the water was running 4 feet higher than the banks he remembered, and moving with the kind of speed that doesn't look dangerous from a distance and is very dangerous up close. Bram stood at the edge and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Several riders came up alongside him and looked at it too. And they were quiet in the particular way of men who understand a problem and are waiting to see who speaks first. Lenora pulled the chuck wagon to a stop 20 yards back from the bank. She set the brake. She climbed down and walked to where the men were standing and looked at the river. "How high was it last time?" she asked Bram. "Knee on the horses," he said. "Moving slow. We crossed in 40 minutes. The river in front of them was chest high on a horse at the nearest point and deeper toward the center, and it was not moving slow. "How far to the next crossing?" she asked. 80 miles south, said Hector, "and that one's probably in the same condition." "North?" "No crossing north for 120. Lenora looked at the river. She turned and looked back at the chuck wagon, at the supply wagon behind it, at the herd strung out along the flat ground to the west. She was doing the mathematics that you do when the mathematics do not produce a comfortable answer, and you do it anyway because comfort is not the point. "How long can we wait?" she said. "We've got 7 days of supplies," Bram said. "If I'm being generous, with the rationing you've been running, maybe 8. River needs 4 or 5 days to drop to crossable." She wasn't asking. "If no more rain upstream." He paused. "Which we can't know." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Denny Pratt, who had ridden up on the outer edge of the group, said, "What if we just—" and then stopped, because he was young enough to know that starting a sentence in a group of more experienced people required more confidence than he currently had. "What if we just what?" Bram said, without any particular edge to it. Denny looked at the water. "What if we crossed the chuck wagon first, without the weight of the full supplies? Made it lighter?" Several men looked at each other. Lenora turned to look at Denny, who straightened slightly under the attention, uncertain whether it was the good kind. "That's not a bad direction," she said carefully. "But the issue isn't the wagon weight. The issue is water height and current speed. A lighter wagon still gets pushed sideways if the current's fast enough, and if the wagon goes sideways in that water, She glanced at Bram. "We lose it," Bram said, "and everything in it." Denny nodded, chastened but not crushed. Lenora looked back at the river, and then at the wagon, and then at the water again, and this time something shifted slightly in her expression. The specific shift that Bram had been noticing for the past 3 weeks, the one that meant she had seen something and was checking it from 2 or 3 angles before saying it out loud. "The current is fastest in the center," she said. "That's how rivers work," Chester said, not unkindly. "The right bank is shallower. You can see it from here. Look at the color of the water. It's lighter there. Sandbar formation, probably." She walked a few paces along the bank to see the angle better. If you entered from downstream of that large flat rock and aimed for a point about 30 yards north of the other bank, rather than straight across, you'd be angling with the current rather than fighting it. The water would push you north, and you'd come out on the shallower stretch. Bram looked at where she was pointing. He looked at the rock. He looked at the north bank. He looked at Hector. Hector studied the line she was describing for a long moment. He was the best riverman in the outfit, a fact that was not officially designated but was universally understood. "She's not wrong about the sandbar," he said. "I was looking at it, but I was thinking about it wrong. I was thinking head on." He paused. "The angle she's talking about, that's actually the line." "The supply wagon first," Lenora said. "Lighter load, bigger wheels, see how the line holds? Then the herd, then the chuck wagon last." "Chuck wagon last puts you in the water after 3,200 head have churned it up," Bram said. "I know. I'll deal with that when we get there. You're not crossing alone." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a logistical discussion required. "All right," he said. "We do it her way." What happened over the next 6 hours was the kind of work that does not produce stories worth telling at supper because it was mostly grinding and frightening and nothing went dramatically wrong, but nothing went easily right either. The supply wagon made the crossing in 40 minutes on Lenora's line, Hector driving, 2 riders alongside, coming out on the north bank 200 yards downstream from where they entered and intact. The herd took 3.5 hours and cost them 1 steer to a hidden drop-off in the riverbed, which Bram absorbed with the quiet expression of a man counting losses and keeping them in proportion. Then the chuck wagon. Lenora drove it herself. She had made the decision without announcing it, which meant that by the time Bram understood what she was doing, she was already in the seat with the reins gathered and her jaw set in a way that communicated clearly that this was not a discussion. "Lenora." He said her name the way people say names when they want to add weight to what comes next. "I know this wagon," she said. "I know how it pulls and I know what its wheel does in soft ground, and I know what it does when the left side gets too much weight. Somebody else doesn't know those things. Somebody else is going to fight it." He looked at her. "Also," she said more quietly, "everything I own is in that wagon. So." That last sentence was not dramatic. It was just true, delivered in the tone of someone stating a fact that explains a decision without asking for sympathy about it. Everything she owned was in that wagon because she had arrived at this camp with 1 pot and 1 card and the wages from 3 weeks of work, and had spent a portion of those wages on 2 things, a decent knife and a waterproof canvas wrap for the recipe card. That was the inventory of Lenora Whitcomb's worldly goods, and she was not going to watch someone else take them into fast water. Bram rode in beside her. He didn't argue further. He just rode in beside her, 1 horse length off her left side, where the current would push her if the line went wrong. Chester took the right. Hector, from the far bank, was shouting directional guidance that was mostly lost in the sound of the water. But Lenora had looked at that line for 2 hours while the rest of the crossing happened, and she had it memorized in the specific way she memorized things that mattered, not as words, but as a physical understanding of space and angle and timing. The water hit the wagon floor at the deepest point, and she felt it, the grab of the current, the whole vehicle shuddering left with a force that was bigger than she had prepared for, even though she had tried to prepare for exactly this. The horses lurched, and one of them scrambled, and she gave it rein immediately, felt the wagon angle downstream, corrected with everything she had, which was not nothing but was also not quite enough. And then Bram's horse was there on the left, and he was doing something with his rope that she didn't have time to look at, and the wagon steadied. They came out of the water on the north bank, at a point that was not where she'd planned, but was not where disaster was either. The horses were blowing hard. Lenora sat in the wagon seat for a moment with the reins loose in her hands and her arms shaking with the delayed understanding of what the current had actually been doing back there. Bram came around to her side. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. His face had the specific expression of a man who has just watched something go wrong enough to scare him and right enough to be grateful and is trying to figure out which of those to lead with. "The left rear wheel is going to need looking at tonight," she said. "I felt something shift on the bottom." "That's what you're thinking about right now. That's what needs thinking about," she said. But her voice was not entirely steady, and he heard that, and she knew he heard it, and neither of them addressed it. She climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were not reliable for a moment after her feet hit the ground. She put one hand on the wagon's sideboard and stood there. Bram dismounted and stood near her without touching her and without making it a moment, which was exactly the right thing to do and which she noticed. "The angle worked," she said after a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It did. Hector's the one who confirmed it was right. Hector's been crossing rivers for 20 years. He looked at that line for 20 minutes, and I watched his face the whole time. He didn't see it until you said it." She didn't respond to that. She pushed off the wagon and walked to check the rear wheel. It needed work. Not catastrophic work, but real work. A split in the felloe that had been marginal before the river and was now committed to becoming a problem. She spent the last light of the evening lying in the mud on the north bank of that river with a borrowed tool set, working on a wagon wheel while 32 men made camp around her, and not one of them told her to stop or offered to take over, which was the most profound form of respect that particular group of people knew how to show. Denny brought her a lantern when the light got bad. He set it down without a word and went back to his supper. She finished the repair and ate her plate of beans cold, sitting on the ground next to the wheel she'd just fixed, and she thought about Thomas, which she did sometimes when she was tired enough that the guard came down. Thomas had been good with his hands. Not these kinds of hands, not field repairs and wagon work, but good with small, careful things, with the particular patience of someone who liked problems that had solutions. He would have liked Denny, she thought. He would have had time for the boy. She put Thomas back in the part of her that was not closed but was not open to just anyone, and she finished her beans and stood up. Bram was nearby, she realized. He'd been sitting on a supply crate in the outer edge of the lantern light, not watching her exactly, but present. He had a cup of coffee and a posture that said he had been there a while. "How long have you been sitting there?" she asked. "A while." "You could have said something. You seemed like you were working something out." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lantern light was not flattering to either of them. It showed the mud on her dress, and the 3 weeks of trail on his face, and the general exhaustion that had settled into both of them like sediment. "I was thinking about my husband," she said. She said it simply, the way she said most things, not as a door opening, but not as a door closing either. Bram nodded. What was he like? It was the right question. Not, "I'm sorry." She'd heard that so many times it had worn through to nothing. Not how long has it been, which was arithmetic, not interest. Just, what was he like? "Patient," she said. "More patient than me, which is saying something because I'm not particularly impatient. I just know what I think, and I think it fast." She paused. "Good at small things. He could fix a clock. Couldn't grow wheat to save his life, but he could fix a clock." Bram smiled at that. A small, private smile that she would not have seen if she hadn't been looking. "Mine was stubborn," he said. It took her a moment to understand what he meant. Margaret, stubborn about the right things and wrong about almost everything that didn't matter, which made her very easy to live with, actually. He looked into his coffee. "Cancer. 3 years ago. Took about 8 months. I'm sorry." "Yeah." He looked up. The 8 months were worse than the losing, in a way. Watching someone you know be... He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind. That's not..." "No," she said. "It is." She looked at the lantern. "Thomas went fast. 3 days of fever, and then he was gone, and I was angry about it for months because he didn't get to say anything. Neither of us got to say anything, and I knew that was not the right way to be angry, but I was angry that way anyway." She paused. "Then I thought, at least he didn't have to watch himself go. At least he didn't have that." She glanced at Bram. "I suppose there's no good version?" "There's no good version," he agreed. They were quiet for a while. in the way of two people who have just exchanged something real and are letting it settle without trying to manage it. I should check on the horses, Bram said eventually. You should, she said. He stood up and picked up his cup. The repair on that wheel is better than what the wheelwright in Dodge did in August, he said. I want you to know I noticed that. She looked at the wheel. He charged you more than it was worth, I assume. He charged me considerably more than it was worth. Well, she said, now you know. He walked off toward the horses and she stood in the lantern light for a moment longer, and then she banked the fire and went to her bedroll. She slept dreamlessly, which had been happening more often lately. 12 days from the railhead, which was 12 days from the end of the drive, 12 days from Iron Mesa and the cattle sale, and the question of what happened after, a question Lenora had been keeping at arm's length with both hands, because it was too big to look at directly, while everything else was still in motion. The prairie in this part of the territory was different from what they'd crossed before. Flatter, drier, the grass shorter and lighter colored. And in the afternoons there was a wind that came from the southwest that was warm for October, unseasonably warm, the kind of warm that people in other parts of the country would enjoy, and that people on the plains in late season recognized as the specific gift that comes with a cost you don't know yet. Lenora noticed the grass. She noticed it the way you notice something when you don't know exactly why you're noticing it. A background unease, a thing your eye keeps returning to without your permission. The grass was dry. Not normal late-season dry, but deep dry, the dry that happens when the summer has been long and the autumn rain hasn't come. The stems were pale and the seed heads were spent, and when you walked through it, the grass made a sound that was more like paper than grass. She mentioned it to Bram on the 4th day past the river. I know, he said. The wind has been warm. I know that too. She looked at him. Have you had fire out here before? Twice. He said it flatly. Once 9 years ago, one time 4 years ago. Both times we got the herd out. What did it take? Speed and luck, he said. Mostly luck. She looked at the grass again. And if the luck doesn't come through? He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was not with false comfort. That's when you need the speed. She filed that information in the same place she filed the river crossing and the storm, in the part of her mind that ran the ongoing calculation of where the danger was and what it would ask of them. The danger announced itself on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky to the south went the particular shade of orange that is not sunset. Lenora was driving the chuck wagon, and she saw it first, or saw it at the same time as the outriders on the south flank, and what she felt was not panic. Panic had never served her well, and she'd spent years training herself out of it, but a very fast, very clear understanding of the situation that arrived whole rather than in pieces. Fire. Wind from the southwest, which meant the fire was moving northeast. The herd was northeast of the smoke. The herd would see it and smell it before the fire reached them and would do what cattle do, which was move, and the question was whether they moved toward the ravine. She knew about the ravine. Bram had pointed it out 2 days ago as a water source. A long, narrow cut in the prairie, steep-sided, 30 feet deep in places. Good for finding water. Catastrophic for cattle in a stampede. She saw all of this in approximately 8 seconds while the wagon was still moving. She also saw something else. The wind was moving the fire at a speed that the herd could not outrun. She understood this with the same clarity she had understood the river current, the same fundamental reading of how fast something large and dangerous was moving versus how fast something larger and less maneuverable could move in response. Bram was already riding hard toward the south flank, shouting orders. The riders on the flank were trying to turn the herd, get it moving north and west, away from the ravine. It was the right call, and she was not questioning it. But the fire was going to catch them anyway. She pulled the wagon to a stop. She climbed down. She looked at the fire, at the wind direction, at the distance, at the ground between the advancing fire and the herd. The ground between the fire and the herd was grass, dry as paper. She turned to Otis, who had ridden up on the supply horse he used when he wasn't managing the wagon. The water barrels, she said. All of them. I need them overturned on the ground here. Otis stared at her. That's our water for Otis. She said his name once, clearly, not loud, but with a directness that stopped him. The fire cannot be outrun. We have to take away what it runs on. He looked at the smoke. He looked at the distance. He was doing the same mathematics she was doing and arriving at the same place she had arrived at. The blankets, he said. moving before she finished nodding. Lenora ran to the camp supply crate. She pulled out every sack and blanket she could reach, handed half to Otis. She turned to the two riders who had come back to the wagon, young men, nervous, waiting for instruction. "Soak these," she said. "Everything you can wet, get it wet now. Use the barrel water, all of it." They moved. She was already walking south toward the strip of ground between the advancing fire and the herd. Bram was there. He had seen her moving and had ridden back, and the expression on his face when he came out was the specific expression of a man who is trying to assess a situation faster than the situation is moving, which is to say, he looked like someone doing two hard things at once. "Lenora's heat. We can't outrun it." She said it directly, no softening. "The herd can't outrun it. If they hit that ravine, I know what happens if they hit the ravine. Then you know we have to burn ahead of it, take away the fuel." She looked at him. "It's the only line that makes sense." He stared at the fire. The smoke was closer now, the orange underbelly darker, and on the wind she could smell it. Not just smoke, but the particular hot, dry smell of grass burning fast. "If the controlled burn moves wrong, I know. If the wind shifts, I know." She held his look. "I know every way it can go wrong, Bram. Tell me one other option that ends differently." He was quiet for 2 seconds that felt like considerably longer. "Chester," he shouted. "Hector, come here now!" He explained it in 30 seconds, the kind of battlefield explanation that leaves out everything except what the next 5 minutes require. Chester's face cycled through alarm and calculation and landed on grim readiness. Hector looked at the strip of ground Lenora was indicating and nodded once. "The line needs to be wide enough that the main fire loses momentum when it hits it," Lenora said. 40 feet at minimum. We start at the north edge and burn south, into the wind. I know that's backward. I know it's slow. It has to be slow, so we control it." "Into the wind," Chester said. "If that doesn't feel like a terrible idea." "It is a terrible idea," she said. "It's the least terrible one we have." Bram looked at her. "Do it," he said. What happened over the next 20 minutes was the most frightening thing Lenora had ever stood through. And she had stood through things that should have been more frightening and had surprised herself at the time by staying upright. But this was different because she was responsible for it. She had proposed it. She had argued for it. And the fire she was watching burn south across 40 feet of dry Nebraska prairie was burning because she had told 32 men and one trail boss that it was the right call. The controlled burn moved slowly against the wind, which was what she'd planned, which meant they could manage its edges with the wet blankets and sacks, beating back any spread to the sides, keeping the strip defined. 3 riders on horseback worked the east edge, 3 more on the west. Otis was on foot on the near side with 2 sacks, working hard, his face red and streaming. Lenora was in the middle of it, not because she had planned to be. She had planned to direct from the edge. But the wind had shifted, briefly and wrong, in the 8th minute, and a section of the burn had jumped its intended line and was moving east in a direction that would have taken it toward the herd, and she was the closest person to it, and so she was the one who ran into the smoke with a soaked blanket and beat it back. The smoke was thick, and it moved in the shifting, unpredictable way of smoke near a fire, and she lost her sense of direction for a moment that was not long but was complete, a moment of not knowing which way was out, just heat and gray and the blanket in her hands and her own coughing. Then someone had her arm. Bram. He pulled her sideways and then forward, and they came out of the worst of the smoke together, and she doubled over coughing for a moment with his hand on her back and the world resolving back into something she could navigate. "I'm fine," she said, before he could ask. "I can see that," he said, in a tone that indicated he could not see that. She straightened, looked at the burn. The controlled strip was holding, 40 feet of blackened, smoldering ground moving south, consuming itself, taking the fuel away. And ahead of them, on the horizon, the main fire hit the eastern edge of the blackened strip. They all watched. The fire slowed. Not immediately, not dramatically. It slowed the way a river slows when it hits shallower ground, losing force but not stopping, spreading left and right looking for something to consume. It found the western edge of the blackened strip and tried there, and found the same thing. It found the eastern edge and found the same thing. The fire did not stop. But it thinned. The wall of it, which had been solid, became ragged, and ragged fire in open prairie is still dangerous, but it is manageable in the way that solid fire is not. And Bram's riders turned the terrified herd north and west and kept them moving, and the ragged fire chased them and did not catch them. When it was done, when the immediate danger had passed and the fire had burned through what was left, and the wind had taken the smoke northeast, and the herd had settled into frightened but moving and intact, Lenora stood in the middle of what had been her controlled burn line and looked south at the blackened ground. The strip held. She was covered in soot, her dress was scorched along the hem. Her right hand, where she'd held the wet blanket against the spot fire, was red and blistered in 2 places and was beginning to register the fact of this with some insistence. She became aware of this slowly, the way you become aware of injuries after the adrenaline finds somewhere else to be. Otis appeared beside her. He looked at her hand. "There's salve in the medicine box," she said. "I know where the salve is," he said. "Come here." He was not gentle exactly, but he was careful, which in Otis was the same thing. He cleaned the blisters with water from the last canteen and applied the salve and wrapped her hand with a strip of clean canvas while she stood there and let him, which was not something that came easily to her and which he seemed to understand required a certain amount of pretending it wasn't happening. "The herd?" she said. "Moving north. They're all right." He tied the canvas wrap. One rider down, Petey Marsh's horse went sideways in the confusion. Petey's ankle. Not broken, I think. "I'll look at it when we stop." "You'll look at it when you sit down for 5 minutes first," Otis said. She looked at him. He looked back. "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm telling you. 5 minutes." She sat down on the burnt ground. Bram came back on horseback, moving at a controlled pace that meant the crisis had shifted from immediate to managed. He came up to where she was sitting and dismounted. He stood over her and looked at the wrapped hand and the scorched dress and the soot that covered her from collar to hem. "The herd is intact," he said. "Lost 3 head in the run. The chuck wagon is intact." He paused. "You saved this outfit today." "The strip held," she said. "That was the question." "You proposed the strip." Hector confirmed it was Lenora. He said her name the way he'd said it at the river, with weight behind it. "You saw it. You said it. The rest of us were still trying to outrun a fire that couldn't be outrun." He looked at her directly. "Take the acknowledgement." She looked at the burnt ground, the strip of blackened prairie that had stood between 3,000 cattle and a ravine and a catastrophe. "Otis says I have 5 minutes," she said. "Otis is right." "He usually is," she said. "Don't tell him I said that." Something moved across Bram's face that was not quite a smile, but was close to the thing that comes before one, a softening, a brief lowering of the particular guard that men who run things keep up most of the time, because running things requires it. He sat down next to her on the burnt ground. They sat there in the smell of smoke and scorched grass, while the herd moved north, and the riders called back and forth in the distance, and the sun started its low western descent toward an evening that neither of them had been certain 90 minutes ago was going to arrive the way they were planning on it. "Cedar Lantern," he said after a while. She glanced at him. "My ranch, that's the name." He looked north toward where the herd was settling. "It's been running about half of what it should be running. I've been doing this drive every year to make up the difference, but the drive only works if the ranch is viable the rest of the year, and right now it's not quite there." He paused. "The cook I had for the past 2 years left in the spring. The place has been—" He stopped. "It's a good piece of land. The valley it sits in holds water better than most. There's a spring that runs year-round. The kitchen is larger than it needs to be for one person, because Margaret always said a kitchen should have room to think in." Lenore said nothing for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she said finally. He looked at her sideways. "I think you know." She looked at her wrapped hand. "I think you're tired," she said. "I think today was a long day and you're sitting in burnt grass and saying things that might look different in the morning." "They might," he agreed. "I've been thinking about them for about 2 weeks, though, so probably not." She looked at the horizon. "I have a dead husband," she said. Not as an objection, just as a fact that was part of the inventory. "I have a dead wife," he said. "I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I'm not asking you anything tonight." She looked at him. "Then what are you doing tonight?" He picked up a piece of scorched grass and turned it in his fingers. "Telling you the name of my ranch," he said, "and that it has a good spring and a kitchen with room to think in." He dropped the grass. "The rest can wait for another conversation." She looked at the burnt ground for a long time. Nobody called her the widow anymore. She had noticed that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without being able to identify when it had stopped. She had not been the widow for days now. She had been Lenora, and then just Lenora. And tonight she had been the person who saw the fire couldn't be outrun, and said so in time to do something about it. She stood up. Her 5 minutes were up. Petey Marsh's ankle needs looking at, she said. Bram stood as well. Lenora. He said it once, quietly. She looked back at him. Cedar Lantern, she said, just the name. Then she walked toward the camp. He stood in the burnt grass and watched her go, and after a moment he followed, because there was work left, and there was always work left. And that was, he had come to understand in his 43 years on this earth, not a burden, but the shape of a life that had things in it worth doing. The camp that night was quieter than usual, with the specific quiet of people who have been frightened and come through and are now processing what that means, each in their own interior way. Lenora made supper from what was left after the chaos. Beans, biscuits, the last of the dried peppers she'd gotten at Stonebridge Crossing. And she served it without comment on the day and without ceremony, because supper was supper, and people needed to eat, and the best thing she could do was make that as normal as possible. Denny Pratt sat near the fire with his blanket around his shoulders and looked into the flames with the expression of someone who is 18 and has just understood something real about the world for the first time. Is it always like that? He said to nobody in particular. Or was today? Today was bad, Chester said. I've done 11 drives. Today was bad. How do you... Denny stopped. How do you just keep going? Chester looked at his plate, then at the fire. You eat, he said. You sleep. You get up. He shrugged. Eventually it's the next day. Lenora at the work table heard this and said nothing, but she thought about it. Eventually it's the next day. She had been living on that principle for 4 months. Getting up because the alternative was not getting up. Eating because the alternative was not eating. Walking toward the smoke because standing in the field with nothing left was not a choice she was willing to make. Eventually, it's the next day. 12 days to iron Misa. She washed the plates, checked the fire, looked at her wrapped hand in the firelight. The blisters would be painful tomorrow, and she would cook anyway, because that was what the job was. And the job was what she had. And for right now, that was enough. She walked to her bedroll. Somewhere in the dark, Augustus the lead steer shifted and made a low sound, and the cattle around him settled in response to it. The herd taking its cue from the one animal that had learned, over years and miles, that most things that frighten you in the night are survivable if you stay with the group and keep moving. She had learned that too, she supposed. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders and closed her eyes, and the smell of smoke in her hair and the ache in her hand and the 12 days that stood between here and what came next were all real and all present, and she was tired enough that none of it kept her awake. The last 12 days of a cattle drive do not get easier because the end is close. That was something Lenora had not understood before this one. That proximity to the finish line does not reduce the weight of the miles. It just adds a new kind of pressure on top of the old kind. The men rode harder because they could see the end. The cattle moved less predictably because the grass was thinner and the water sources less reliable. Equipment that had held together for 3 months decided that 12 days was an acceptable time to stop holding together, and every morning brought something new that needed managing before the day could begin. Lenora's hand healed badly for the first 4 days, and then began healing correctly on the 5th, which was roughly how injuries worked when you kept using them. She rewrapped it every morning and didn't mention it, and Otis rewrapped it every evening without being asked, which was their arrangement, unspoken and precise. The blisters were the least of it. What the last 12 days brought, in the specific and unglamorous sequence they arrived, was this. A broken axle pin on the chuck wagon that cost them 4 hours on day 2 and required a piece of metal from the spare harness set that Lenora had reorganized at Stonebridge Crossing, and which she had specifically saved against this kind of eventuality. Then Denny Pratt's horse threw a shoe in soft ground on day 5, and Denny rode bareback for 6 hours rather than say anything about it, which Lenora discovered when she noticed the specific way he was walking when he came to supper, and which she fixed by giving him the liniment she kept for exactly this kind of absorbed punishment. Then Petey Marsh's ankle, which had seemed manageable after the fire, turned out to be a small fracture rather than a sprain, which meant Petey rode with his boot off and his foot wrapped for the last week of the drive, eating his meals with his leg elevated on a supply crate and maintaining a dignity about it that Lenora found quietly admirable. She cooked around all of it. She always cooked around all of it. But it was on the 9th day from the railhead that something happened which had nothing to do with equipment or injuries, something that arrived without any of the usual physical warning signs, and which turned out to be the thing she least expected and most needed to be prepared for. They had stopped for the midday rest near a dry creek bed with enough shade to make it worth the pause, and most of the men had eaten and were resting in that flat, conserving way of people who understand that the horses need the break more than they do. Bram had ridden out with Hector to look at the terrain ahead. Otis was asleep against a wagon wheel with his hat over his face, which was his right after 11 years of rising before dawn. Lenora was repackaging the remaining flour into smaller portions against the possibility of moisture. It was an unnecessary task because they were 9 days out and the weather was dry, but she had run out of necessary tasks and her hands needed something to do when her head was busy. Cal Devers came and sat on the supply crate nearby. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had his oil of cloves bottle in his hand, turning it over. The tooth had been bad and then worse, and then had apparently decided to reach some kind of unstable equilibrium that was not good but was endurable, which was roughly the kind of resolution most problems in his life had reached. "My daughter would be about your age," he said. Lenora looked up from the flour. "I haven't seen her in 11 years, he said. "Not since she was 12. He was looking at the bottle. "Her mother and I, there wasn't a clean answer to any of it. I left because staying was worse. I've told myself that enough times that I almost believe it's true." He turned the bottle over. "She'd be 23 now. I don't know where she is." Lenora set down the flour. "Do you want to know?" she said. He looked up. "I'm not asking to pry," she said. "I'm asking because wanting and not doing are different things from not wanting, and they feel like the same thing for a while, but eventually they're not." He looked at the bottle for a long moment. "She probably doesn't want to hear from me." "She might not," Lenora said. "That's possible." She folded the flour bag closed. "But a lot of things are possible. The ones that are actually true are usually worth checking on." Cal said nothing for a moment. Then he put the bottle back in his vest pocket. "You talk like someone who's had to figure out the difference between what's true and what's comfortable," he said. "I've had occasion," she said. He nodded, stood up, looked at the dry creek bed. "I'm going to write her a letter when we get to Iron Mesa," he said. "I might not send it right away, but I'm going to write it." "That's a start," Lenora said. He walked back to his horse. She looked at the flour and then at the dry creek bed and then at nothing in particular, thinking about letters written and not sent, about things started that were not yet finished, about the particular courage required for the first step that does not guarantee the second one. Thomas had kept letters. She had found them after he died. Not letters he'd received, but letters he'd written and not sent. To his brother, who he'd argued with badly when they were young and hadn't spoken to in 15 years. 3 letters, different years, none of them mailed. She had sat on the floor of the farmhouse for an hour with those letters, and then she had mailed all 3 of them herself, addressed to the last address she knew for the brother, and she had written one line at the bottom of each one. He wrote this. He meant it. "I thought you should have it. L." She didn't know if they arrived. She didn't know if the brother got them, or what he did with them, or whether they meant anything to him. She had never heard back, but she had also not given a return address, because the point was not to receive something. The point was to give the letters their proper ending. She thought about that sometimes. She went back to the flour. Iron Mesa announced itself the way frontier towns do when you've been on the trail long enough. First as an idea, a name on the wind, and then as distant shapes on the horizon that become buildings slowly over the course of 2 days of riding until they are real and specific and full of people who have not spent 4 months eating camp food and sleeping on the ground. The herd was delivered to the stockyards on a Friday morning. This part of the drive, the actual transfer of cattle, the counting and the weighing and the negotiating with buyers who had seen everything and were professionally skeptical of everything, was not Lenora's domain, and she understood that. She managed the camp on the south side of town while Bram and Hector and 2 other experienced riders handled the sale, which took most of the day and involved a great deal of waiting and a few heated conversations that she could see from a distance by reading posture and hand gestures. She spent the day cleaning the chuck wagon with a thoroughness that it had not received since June, going through every compartment, sorting what was salvageable from what was finished, making an honest accounting of what the drive had consumed and what had survived and what should have been replaced 2 states ago and wasn't. It was meditative work. She had always found this kind of work meditative, the kind that engages the hands completely and leaves the mind free to run in whatever direction it chooses. It chose Bram. She let it, because it was going to anyway, and pretending otherwise was a waste of energy. Cedar Lantern Valley. A spring that ran year-round. A kitchen with room to think in. She had been turning those words over for 9 days, in the same careful way she turned problems over, looking for the angle, looking for what they were actually asking, looking for the place where she needed to be honest with herself, even if the honesty was inconvenient. The inconvenient truth was this: she wanted to see Cedar Lantern Valley. Not as an employment opportunity, not as a next step in the logical sequence of her survival. She wanted to see the place Bram Coulter had been carrying in his chest for 4 months while he drove 3,200 head of cattle across rivers and through fires. And she wanted to know whether the kitchen was actually as large as Margaret had insisted it should be, and she wanted to know what the spring sounded like. She also still had Thomas in the quiet center of her, and Thomas did not feel like a reason not to want those things, but he felt like a weight that deserved respect, and she was trying to figure out how to hold both of those things at once because she had not done this before, had not had occasion to figure out how grief and the future could occupy the same space without one erasing the other. She was still working on it when Bram came back that evening. He came alone, on his horse, and he stopped at the edge of the camp, and his face had the compressed, private expression of a man who has just completed something significant and has not yet decided how to feel about it. She walked to meet him. "Well?" she said. "Enough," he said. "Not what I'd hoped, but enough. The ranch is safe." He dismounted. "The banknote has a margin now. Not a large one, but a real one." "That's what this whole thing was for," she said. "Yes." He looked at the horse's bridle and then at her. It was. There was something in the space around the word was that she registered but set aside, because there were 32 men to feed tonight, and the matter of wages to be sorted, and a dozen other things that were concrete and immediate and required dealing with before anything abstract could be addressed. "Supper in an hour," she said, and went back to the wagon. She made the best meal she'd made on the entire drive that night, not because the ingredients were dramatically better. They were better, she'd resupplied from the Iron Mesa General Store that afternoon, but because she had the time and she had the energy, and she realized, cooking for these men for the last time. And she wanted the last time to be something they remembered. She made a proper stew with real beef, the first beef she'd had since before Thomas died, purchased from the butcher at the south end of town at a price that was reasonable. She made biscuits that rose correctly. She made a gravy that used the full stock she'd been building for 4 days and that reduced down into something that smelled like a kitchen rather than a camp. She made dried apple slices with cinnamon sugar, which she'd found at the general store and purchased with her own money, because there was no line item in camp supplies for something that was only pleasure, and she thought these men deserved one thing that was only pleasure. When the camp ate that night, it was quiet in the way that the very first meal had been quiet, the concentrated silence of people genuinely tasting what they're eating. Chester looked at the apple slices with an expression that was difficult to read. "Where did these come from?" he said. "General store," Lenora said. "Who?" "Don't worry about it, Chester." He ate the apple slice and said nothing further, but he ate it slowly, which from Chester was a significant statement. Denny Pratt ate everything on his plate and then looked at the pot hopefully, and she gave him more, and he ate that too, and it occurred to her that he had probably put on 15 pounds since May and was going to go home to Missouri, looking like someone who had actually been fed, which was the best thing that could be said about 4 months of hard work. After supper, Bram paid the men. He did it the way he did everything, without ceremony, directly, with a handshake for each one, and a few words that were specific to the individual rather than general to the group. She watched him work around the fire, stopping at each man, and she saw the men receive what he gave them. Not just the money, but the words, the specific acknowledgement, with the particular quiet of people who are not expecting to be seen clearly and are surprised to find that they have been. He came to her last. He held out an envelope. She opened it, as she always did, because she had learned to verify rather than assume. She counted the bills, and then she counted them again because the number was wrong. "This is too much," she said. "It's what I'm paying you. We agreed on 12 a month." She held the envelope out toward him. "This is considerably more than—" "The agreement was made before you saved the drive twice," he said. "Before the river, before the fire." Those weren't... She stopped. I did my job. You did considerably more than your job. Bram. She said his name the way he said hers, with weight. I want what I earned, not what you think you owe me. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Take the extra, he said. Not as a debt, as what it is, the fair value of what you contributed. The fair value is 12 a month. That's what we... The fair value, he said, quietly but clearly, of what you contributed to this drive is considerably more than $36, Lenora. You know that and I know that. The extra is not charity. It is not pity. It is a trail boss paying his best asset what she was actually worth. He paused. And I've never paid anyone less than they were worth. I'm not starting now. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. This conversation isn't over, she said. I know, he said. She put the envelope in her apron pocket. That was the last moment of uncomplicated success. The complication arrived the next morning in the form of Agatha Crowell. Agatha Crowell owned the Iron Mesa boarding house, which was the only establishment in town that provided respectable lodging for respectable women, a category that Agatha administered with the specific authority of someone who has made themselves the gatekeeper and intends to hold the gate. She was somewhere in her 60s, small and precise, with white hair dressed in a careful arrangement that suggested she had been dealing with the frontier on her own terms for long enough that the frontier had mostly conceded. Lenora had gone to the boarding house that morning for the straightforward purpose of securing a room for the 2 or 3 days it would take to sort out the end-of-drive business before deciding on her next direction. She had money. She had a legitimate need. She had conducted herself in a manner that she was prepared to describe plainly and without apology. She stood at the counter in the boarding house front room, which smelled of lye soap and something baked that morning, and she stated her request simply. Agatha looked at her. You came in with the Coulter outfit, she said. I was the camp cook, yes. The only woman in a camp of 32 men. She said it without particular venom. That was almost worse than venom. The flat, administrative quality of it, as if she were reciting a policy from a handbook. For 4 months. For 6 weeks, to be accurate. I joined late in the drive. 6 weeks. Agatha folded her hands on the counter. I'm sure you understand that this establishment has a reputation to maintain. The women who stay here are vouched for by family or by established businesses in the area. A woman who has been living, she paused, choosing the word with visible care. In those circumstances, without any chaperone or oversight, I had the oversight of 32 witnesses, Lenora said, every hour of every day. That is precisely the concern, Agatha said. And there it was. The logic that could not be argued because it was not actually logic, but a feeling dressed in logic's clothes. Too many men meant no men. The quantity that should have provided safety was being used as evidence of its absence. Lenora stood at that counter and felt something move through her that was tired and old, and not specifically about this moment. It was about the moment behind it and the moment behind that. The whole long corridor of moments in which she had been assessed and found wanting. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what she was and where she had been and the specific variety of difficult her life had taken. She was very tired of that corridor. I see, she said. Her voice was even. She picked up her bag from the counter. Thank you for your time. She walked toward the door. She was going to find another arrangement. There was always another arrangement. She had been finding other arrangements since June, and she was good at it, and it would not break her. She was entirely confident it would not break her, and the fact that her jaw was tight and her hand was aching in the wrapped blisters, and she had slept on the ground for 6 weeks, and all she had wanted was a room with a door that locked from the inside. That was manageable. Everything was manageable. She pushed open the boarding house door and walked out into the Iron Mesa morning. Bram was across the street. He had come for a different reason, to speak with one of the merchants about a supply account, and he saw her come out of the boarding house with her bag still in her hand and her posture carrying the specific quality of someone containing something difficult, and he crossed the street. What happened? He said. She told him. Plainly, the way she told him everything. The relevant facts, in order, without performance. His face changed while she was talking. Not explosively, not with the quick heat of someone reacting before they've thought. It changed the way things change in him. Slowly,
from the inside, working its way out through the jaw and the eyes, until by the time she finished speaking, he looked like a man who had arrived at a conclusion some time before the sentence was done. "Come with me," he said. "Bram, you don't need to—" "Come with me," he said again. She almost argued. She was built for arguing when arguing was the right response. But there was something in his face that was not anger on her behalf. Or not only that, but something more personal, something that belonged to him as much as to the situation, and she followed him because she wanted to see what it was. He walked back into the boarding house. Agatha looked up. Bram stood at the counter with Lenora beside him and said, without preamble, "I'd like you to explain to me what policy prevents Lenora Whitcomb from securing a room in this establishment." Agatha explained. She was less smooth about it the second time, explaining it to a man of visible standing in the community, but she explained it with the conviction of someone who believes they are right. Bram listened to all of it. "Lenora Whitcomb saved my cattle from a wildfire," he said when Agatha finished. "She crossed a flooded river in a wagon when most of the men in my outfit were not willing to. She fed 32 riders through a storm that destroyed half our supplies, and not one of those men went hungry. She did all of this with more dignity than most people show in comfortable circumstances." He paused. "She has my complete professional and personal endorsement, and if this establishment has a policy that prevents a woman of her character from securing a room here, then I will be informing every businessman in this town that the Coulter outfit will be conducting its end-of-drive business somewhere that has better judgment." Agatha said nothing for a moment. "That's not—" she started. "I'd appreciate it if you'd make a decision," Bram said. "We have a full day ahead." Agatha looked at Lenora. Lenora looked back at her with an expression that was not triumphant and was not pleading. It was just steady, the way she was steady, the exhausting and necessary steadiness of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that how you hold yourself in the moment after is as important as what gets said during it. "I'll need payment for 3 nights in advance," Agatha said. "Of course," Lenora said. That was when the door opened. Otis came in first, then Chester, then Hector Vane, who ducked slightly because of the doorframe, then the others in ones and twos, filling up the front room of the boarding house until it was crowded in a way it had clearly never been designed for, 32 men in trail-worn clothes with their hats in their hands, standing in the proprietor's front parlor because someone had said there was a situation and they had come. Denny Pratt was in the back, standing on his toes to see over Hector's shoulder. Agatha stared at them. Bram had not called for them. He had not had time. They had been across the street or around the corner or somewhere nearby, because after 4 months on a trail drive together, you tend to know where people are without being told, and when they had seen Bram cross the street with a particular kind of speed they had followed, the way cattle follow the lead steer when the lead steer moves with purpose. Otis looked at Bram. Bram looked at Otis. "We heard there was a problem," Otis said. "There was," Bram said. "It's being resolved." Otis looked at Agatha with the expression he reserved for food he found insufficient. It was a devastating expression, and he was fully aware of its effect, and he deployed it without apology. "Anyone in this camp has a concern about the arrangements here," Bram said, to the room in general, to Agatha specifically. "They can direct it to me. If this establishment chooses not to accommodate our cook, then we will be finding another way to spend our end-of-drive money, and I will be having a conversation with the stockyard manager about which establishments the Coulter outfit considers worth recommending to other trail crews coming through." The stockyard manager's opinion mattered in Iron Mesa. His opinion mattered in the specific way that the opinion of anyone who directs large amounts of commerce through a small town matters, which is significantly. Agatha's composure was intact, but it was working hard to stay that way. Cal Devers, from near the door, said, "I've been on 8 drives in 12 years. The best cook I ever worked with is standing in this room right now. And I don't spend my wages in establishments that can't tell the difference between a woman's character and her circumstances." Several men murmured agreement that was not dramatic but was unanimous. Denny, from the back, said nothing. But he was standing very straight and his jaw was set in the way of someone who is 18 and has discovered that there are things worth standing straight for. Agatha looked at the room full of men. She looked at Lenora. Lenora did not look victorious. She did not look vindicated. She looked, if anything, slightly overwhelmed. In the careful, contained way she was overwhelmed by things. Holding it behind the steadiness, processing it privately, keeping the surface even. "The room is available," Agatha said. "As I said,
3 nights paid in advance. Thank you, Lenora said. She meant it, not sarcastically. She meant it the way she meant things, which was literally. She paid for the room. The men filed out with considerably more noise than they had filed in, and there was something happening among them in the street outside. A release of tension that expressed itself in the way of men, as noise and ribbing and several people telling Denny to put his jaw back where it belonged, and Denny grinning wider than he had all drive. Bram stayed. He stood near the counter and looked at Lenora, who was putting the change from the room into her apron pocket alongside the envelope of wages, and he said quietly, "I'm sorry that was necessary." "Don't be," she said. "I've had worse." "You've said that before." "It keeps being true." He looked at her. "It shouldn't keep being true." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the way he said it, not as a platitude, not as a well-meaning abstraction, but as a statement of genuine anger at a situation, directed at the situation rather than at her, which was rarer than it should have been. "No," she said. "It shouldn't." She picked up her bag. "Cedar lantern," she said, the way she'd said it 3 nights ago in the burnt grass. Just the name. He looked at her. "Tell me about the spring," she said, "the one that runs year-round. What does it sound like?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when something surprised him, and he was deciding what to do with the surprise. "It's fast," he said. "Comes out of a rock formation on the north side of the valley. It sounds like something that doesn't know how to be still. Not loud, just constant." He paused. "Margaret used to sit near it in the evenings. Said it was the only thing on the whole ranch that never had an agenda." Lenora almost smiled. "I'll want to see it," she said. "I know," he said. She walked to the stairs. "The extra in the envelope," she said, without turning around. "I'll keep it on the condition that it goes toward wages for what comes next. Not as a gift. As an advance." She heard him absorb that. "That's fair?" he said. "I think so too," she said, and went upstairs. The room was small and it smelled like the lye soap she'd noticed when she came in, and the mattress was not what anyone would call generous, but there was a door and it locked from the inside. And she turned that lock and stood in the room for a moment in the specific silence of someone who has been surrounded by 32 people for 6 weeks and is now completely alone. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her hand ached. Her back ached in the deep, accumulated way of weeks of wagon driving and ground sleeping. She was 34 years old and she felt 44, and she suspected that was a fair trade for what the past 4 months had been. She opened her bag and took out the recipe card. It was her mother's handwriting, slanted and particular. The ink faded to brown, the card soft from years of handling. Bean and salt pork stew, the way her mother made it, the way her grandmother had made it before that, handed down through women who had cooked in difficult places with insufficient ingredients, and had made it work because that was what was available to make work. She had cooked from this card on the first night. She had not needed to look at it once since then. She held it for a moment, feeling the particular weight of something that has been carried for a long time, and then she tucked it back into its waterproof canvas wrap, the one she'd bought with her own wages at Stonebridge Crossing, and put it in the bottom of her bag. Outside the window, Iron Mesa was doing what frontier towns do at the end of a drive week. Loud and busy and complicated, full of men with money and decisions, and the specific kind of restlessness that comes from months of one kind of purpose suddenly replaced with a different kind of openness. She could hear Denny's laugh from 2 streets over. She lay down on the small bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about Cedar Lantern Valley, and a spring that didn't know how to be still, and a kitchen with room to think in, and the particular kind of work that might come next. Not survival work, not proving herself work, but the daily, unglamorous, deeply satisfying work of building something that had a chance of lasting. She thought about the table her mother had kept in their kitchen, where anyone who came to the door at mealtime was seated without question. Not a rule, not a charity, just the assumption that the door was for entering and the table was for everyone, and that was how a kitchen worked. She thought about how she would explain it to the men when they came back through on the next drive. That the table was there, that no one went away hungry who could do honest work, not complicated, not noble, just the way things should work. She was asleep before she finished the thought. Outside, Bram stood in the Iron Mesa street with Otis beside him, looking at the boarding house window. "She's going to say yes," Otis said. It was not a question. I don't know that, Bram said. I do, Otis said. I've been watching people cook for 11 years. You can tell a lot about a person by what they do when they're down to the last of something. He put his hat on. She never wastes anything. Not food, not effort, not feeling. When she decides something is worth investing in, she invests completely. He glanced at Bram. She's been thinking about Cedar Lantern for a week, I noticed. Bram looked at the window. You notice too much, he said. Occupational habit, Otis said, same as hers. He started walking. Buy me a coffee and stop standing in the street staring at a building. Bram followed him. The afternoon moved through its hours and the town moved through its business, and somewhere upstairs in a locked room, a woman slept the deep, genuine sleep of someone who has earned it by a considerable margin, and the recipe card from her mother sat wrapped in waterproof canvas at the bottom of her bag, and the spring at Cedar Lantern Valley ran over its rocks 200 miles north with the sound of something that doesn't know how to be still. She slept for 14 hours. She knew this because the light coming through the boarding house window was the same low-angle morning light it had been when she finally lay down. But it was the next morning's version of it, and the town outside was making different sounds. The early sounds of commerce starting rather than the late sounds of commerce finishing. She lay on the small mattress for a moment, taking stock of her body, the way she took stock of supplies. Methodically, without drama. Noting what was damaged and what was merely tired and what had recovered enough to be useful. The hand was better. The back was not recovered but was manageable. Her mind was, for the first time in 6 weeks, quiet. Not empty. She was not built for empty, but quiet. The way a kitchen is quiet, when everything is in order and the fire is right and you have what you need and know what you're making. She washed her face in the basin, changed into the second dress she owned. The one that had been at the bottom of her bag since Stonebridge Crossing, washed and folded and saved against exactly this occasion, and went downstairs. Agatha Crowell was in the front parlor when she came down. The older woman was arranging something on the side table, something that did not require the particular focus she was applying to it, and Lenora understood that she had been waiting. There's coffee in the kitchen, Agatha said, without turning around. And biscuits. They're adequate. Lenora stopped. Thank you, she said. Agatha turned. She looked at Lenora with an expression that had shed most of yesterday's armor, and what was underneath it was complicated in the way that people are complicated when they have done something they are not entirely proud of and are trying to decide how to carry it. You were on your own for how long before you joined that drive, she said. 4 months, Lenora said. Since June. Agatha looked at her for a moment. I've been on my own for 11 years, she said, since my husband died. She paused. I built this establishment from a rooming house that had a bad reputation and a good location. I spent 5 years making it respectable. She set down whatever she'd been arranging. I have done things in the name of protecting that reputation that I am not. She stopped. That I should reconsider. It was not an apology exactly. It was a woman of 60-something explaining herself to another woman in a way that cost her something, and Lenora valued it as that. People protect what they built, Lenora said. I understand that. What you did yesterday, Agatha said, turning around and walking out rather than arguing with me. That was either very wise or very tired. Both, Lenora said. Mostly tired. Agatha made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. Go have your coffee, she said. The biscuits are adequate, as I said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Adequate is respectable, Lenora said. Better than most things I've eaten in 6 weeks. The coffee was good and the biscuits were indeed adequate, and she ate at the kitchen table and thought about the day ahead and what she needed to do with it. There were practical things, the end-of-drive accounting with Bram, which they had not finished because the boarding house situation had occupied the afternoon. The matter of what she was taking with her and what she was leaving. She had come with 1 pot and 1 card, and she was leaving with considerably more, and she needed to think clearly about what that meant and what came next. And there was the conversation she had been having in pieces for the past 2 weeks, in the burnt grass and the boarding house counter and the street outside, the conversation that had a name and a shape, and that she had been approaching from the outside, circling it the way you circle a fire to understand its perimeter before you decide to stand near it. She finished the coffee, washed her own cup, from habit, which made Agatha, passing through the kitchen, pause and look at her, but say nothing. She went to find Bram. He was at the stockyard office, which was where she expected him to be, sitting across from a man in a brown coat who had the expression of someone finalizing paperwork and finding it laborious. Bram saw her through the window and raised one finger. 5 minutes. And she nodded and stood outside in the October morning sun and waited. The town around her was doing its particular version of a Friday morning. Wagons and horses and people conducting the business of living, none of it spectacular, all of it continuous. A woman across the street was hanging laundry with the efficient, slightly impatient movements of someone who has hung laundry 10,000 times and has not yet found the part of it that becomes easier with repetition. 2 men outside the hardware store were having a conversation that involved one of them pointing repeatedly at something Lenora couldn't see and the other one shaking his head with equal repetition. Ordinary life. She had forgotten, slightly, what it looked like from the inside of it. The trail had its own completeness, its own world, with its own rules, and stepping back into the ordinary world always required a moment of readjustment that nobody ever warned you about because it seemed like it should be easy. Going back to normal should be easy. And it was not. Bram came out. He looked like he'd slept and eaten, which were 2 things she was glad to see. He had shaved, which was different enough from the trail version of him that she registered it consciously. "The sale is finalized," he said. "Good. The banknote is—" He stopped. "It's handled. The ranch is solid." "Good," she said again, meaning it. He looked at her. She looked at him. They had spent 6 weeks in close proximity in difficult circumstances, and they had arrived at the specific shorthand of people who have been through things together, where entire conversations can happen in the space of a look, and this one was having that kind of conversation. "Walk with me," she said. They walked south from the stockyard, away from the main commercial street, toward the edge of town where the buildings thinned out and the prairie started again. It was not a planned destination. They walked because walking made the conversation easier, because side by side is sometimes the right geometry for things that are hard to say face to face. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you told me, about Cedar Lantern." "I assumed you had been." "I've been thinking about it the way I think about problems," she said, looking for the angles, looking for where it works and where it doesn't. "And?" She was quiet for a few steps. "It works in most of the ways that matter practically," she said. "I know how to run a ranch kitchen. I know how to manage supplies for large groups. I can stretch a budget and I can manage people and I can deal with whatever the trail brings in, because I've now done it for 6 weeks in conditions that were not gentle." She paused. "Those are the practical parts. What are the other parts?" She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The edge of town was just ahead, the last building and then open grass, dry and pale in the October light, running out to where the horizon did the thing it does on the plains, that particular flatness that makes the sky look enormous. "Thomas," she said, not as a reason not to, as something I need to say plainly, so it's not just sitting between us unacknowledged. She looked at the grass. "I'm not done missing him. I don't think I will ever be completely done missing him. The missing changes shape over time, but I don't think it goes away, and I am not interested in pretending it does or finding someone who needs me to pretend it does." "I know," Bram said. "You say that." "I mean it." He turned toward her. "I told you about Margaret. I told you what the 8 months were. What I didn't tell you is that I still catch myself sometimes, at the end of a long day, turning to say something to her and then—" He stopped. Let the stop do the work. "It doesn't happen as often, but it happens. And I'm not interested in a situation where that has to be hidden or explained or apologized for." She looked at him. "So we just carry them with us," she said. "Both of them." "I think we already are," he said. "I think the question is whether we carry them toward something or just carry them." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that a hawk somewhere overhead made its slow circle and moved on, and the grass moved in the light wind and the town behind them continued its Friday morning without concern for what was being decided at its edge. "I want to see the spring," she said finally. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." She looked at him. "I'll come to Cedar Lantern, not as your cook, not as— I need to see the place before I know what I am there. I need to walk around in it for a while and understand what it asks of me and what I can actually give it." She paused. "Is that honest enough?" That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in about 3 years, he said. Is it enough? He looked at the grass, then at her. He had the expression of a man who wanted to say something that was not entirely rational and was deciding whether to say it anyway, which was a decision she had watched him make before, on the riverbank, in the burnt grass. And he always, she had noticed, came down on the side of saying the thing. I've driven cattle for 20 years, he said. I have made decisions about rivers and weather and men and markets, and I have been wrong enough times to have a healthy respect for being wrong. He paused. The last thing I was certain about, before the day you walked into my camp, was that the drive would make the sale, and the sale would make the note, and the note would mean the ranch was safe. That was the shape of my certainty, and it was a very small shape. He looked at her directly. You are the first uncertain thing I have been confident about in a long time, Lenora. That doesn't make sense, and I know it doesn't make sense, and I'm saying it anyway because it's true. She held his look for a long moment. Cedar lantern, she said. Not a question this time, an answer. He nodded. They walked back into town. The remaining days in Iron Mesa resolved themselves the way endings do when the main decisions have been made, with diminishing drama and increasing logistics. Bram settled accounts. Hector and Chester filed out on the second day, heading south toward their respective winter arrangements, with handshakes that lasted slightly longer than handshakes usually last, and said the things that the men themselves did not say because that was not how they said things. Cal Devers came to Lenora the morning before he left. He had the look of someone who has done something difficult and is still in the middle of deciding how he feels about it. I wrote the letter, he said. She waited. I sent it too. He put his hands in his pockets. Last night, before I could change my mind again. He looked at the street. I don't know what happens now. Nobody ever does, she said. That's not particularly comforting. No, she agreed. It's not. But it's true, which is better than comfortable in the long run. She looked at him. You did the right thing, Cal. Not because it'll necessarily work out, just because it was the right thing. He nodded. He started to walk away and then stopped. That tooth is going to need a proper dentist in the spring, he said. I know. Go find one. Yes, ma'am. He walked away. She watched him go and thought about the 3 unmailed letters at the bottom of a farmhouse drawer and the brother who had received them from a woman he'd never met, and whether any of it had mattered, and decided, as she had decided before, that the mattering was not really the point. The point was the sending. The point was finishing what needed finishing, so it wasn't still open when everything else closed. Denny Pratt was the last to go. He came to the boarding house on the 3rd morning with his horse and his pay and the general air of someone who has been trying to work up to a thing and has finally arrived at the doing of it. I'm going home, he said, to Missouri. Good, she said. My family... He stopped. I thought I'd left because there wasn't room, but I think maybe I left because I didn't know yet what I was worth taking up room. He said this with the particular awkwardness of an 18-year-old expressing something true that they've arrived at recently and haven't had time to wear smooth yet. I think I might know a little better now. Lenora looked at him. At the boy who had ridden back for onions in the dark on the first night, who had brought the lantern without being asked, who had stood on his toes at the back of Agatha Crowell's parlor with his jaw set. You know considerably better, she said. Don't let Missouri talk you out of it. He grinned, the wide, uncomplicated grin of 18, the kind that doesn't know yet how many things are going to try to narrow it over the years. That stew, he said, from the last night. I'm going to remember that stew for the rest of my life. Then tell me what was in it, she said. He listed the ingredients with the precision of someone who had paid close attention. He got all of it right. Good, she said. You remember the proportions? You can make it yourself someday. I don't cook. You didn't pull wild onions in the dark at 6 weeks ago either, she said. He thought about this, nodded. Fair point. He tipped his hat, a gesture he'd been practicing, she suspected, for about a month. Thank you, ma'am, for all of it. Eat properly, she said, and write your mother. He rode out. She stood in the street and watched him go until she couldn't see him anymore, and then she went inside and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel, privately and thoroughly and without performance, the particular bitter sweetness of endings that are also beginnings, which are the hardest kind because you cannot fully mourn the one while anticipating the other, and you cannot fully anticipate the other while still sitting inside the one. She gave herself 20 minutes for it. Then she packed her bag. The wagon Bram had arranged for the drive north to Cedar Lantern was not the chuck wagon that had been left with a wheelwright in Iron Mesa for repairs that it genuinely needed, and the plan was to collect it in the spring when the next drive was being organized. The wagon they were taking was a lighter supply wagon with 2 horses that were fresh rather than trail-worn, and it moved at a pace that felt almost easy after 6 weeks behind the chuck wagon's reluctant left wheel. Otis was coming to Cedar Lantern. This had been decided in the way that things were decided between Bram and Otis, not as a formal offer and acceptance, but as a practical acknowledgement of an obvious fact. Bram saying the ranch kitchen needed proper management over the winter, and Otis saying he supposed he wasn't going anywhere particular, and both of them arriving at the same place by different roads. Otis sat in the back of the supply wagon on the first day of the ride north with his hat over his face, apparently asleep, and contributed to the conversation happening on the wagon seat in front of him by occasionally offering single sentences from under the hat that were always relevant and always had the slightly irritating quality of being correct. The first day was flat and cold and straightforward. The second day brought hills, and with the hills came a change in the grass, greener, holding more moisture, the soil darker underneath. Lenora noticed this the way she noticed everything on the physical landscape, as information rather than scenery. "The valley is in the lee of those hills," Bram said when she looked at them. "Catches the weather different, more rain in summer, more shelter in winter." "The grass is different already," she said. "It gets better as you go north." Otis, from under his hat, "The spring water makes the difference. Underground flow that comes up through limestone, keeps the soil from going as dry." "You've been here before?" Lenora said. "3 times, Otis said. "Helped with a drive in '79. And twice after Margaret—" He stopped. "Bram needed someone who knew the kitchen. I came up for a few months each time." She looked at the back of the wagon, where Otis was arranged in a posture that suggested unconsciousness, but was clearly something else entirely. "You've been running that camp kitchen and feeding 32 men for 4 months every year," she said, "and coming up here in the off-season." "Someone has to," he said. She looked at Bram. He was looking at the road ahead with the expression of someone who is aware he is being looked at and is choosing not to acknowledge it. "You two are going to be impossible in an actual kitchen, aren't you?" she said. "Probably," Otis said from under the hat. "Yes," Bram said, to the road. She faced forward. "Good," she said. "I work better with opposition." Cedar Lantern Valley appeared on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It appeared the way Bram had described. Gradually, as the hills opened and the road curved down into a crease in the landscape that held light differently from the country around it. And then all at once, the valley floor, wider than she'd expected, the creek running through the center of it with real water, the ranch buildings arranged along the near slope in a way that suggested they had been placed with thought, rather than just erected wherever was most convenient. The house was larger than she'd imagined. Not grand, not in the way of people who built to impress, but substantial, the kind of substantial that comes from building for duration rather than appearance. 2 stories. A covered porch running the length of the front. A kitchen addition on the north end that was, as advertised, larger than the main house proportions required, with 2 south-facing windows that caught the afternoon light at an angle that made everything inside them look warm. She saw the spring before they reached the house. It came out of a rock formation on the north side of the valley, exactly as he'd described, and she heard it from the wagon. Not loud, just present, a constant quiet sound that threaded underneath everything else, the way a bass note threads underneath a melody. Something that doesn't know how to be still. She said nothing about it, but she heard it. They stopped in front of the house and climbed down, and Bram opened the front door, and the house had the particular smell of a place that has been closed but not abandoned. Wood and dust and the ghost of fires, but also something underneath those things that was the smell of a place that had been lived in and well. Lenora walked through the front room, through the hallway, and into the kitchen without being directed. She stood in it. 2 south windows, a work table along the east wall that was longer than any work table she had ever personally owned, a wood range that had been a good one in its time and would need cleaning but was repairable. shelving along the north wall with room for considerably more than it currently held. A door on the west side that opened, she discovered, to a small covered porch where the morning light would come in from the east and make the whole room different from the evening version of itself. It had room to think in. Margaret had been right about that. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, not doing anything, just standing in it. Bram came to the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame and watched her stand in it, and he did not say anything, which was the right thing. "The range needs work," she said eventually. "I know. The shelving on the north side needs another row at the top. Wasted space. I've got lumber. The work table is good." She ran her hand along it. "Someone built this for someone who actually worked." "Margaret," he said. "She designed it, made me rebuild it twice until it was the right height." Lenora looked at the table. She thought about Margaret, who she would never meet, but who had insisted on a kitchen with room to think in and a work table at the right height and a spring close enough to hear from the house. She thought about the care embedded in those decisions, the care of a woman who understood that a kitchen was not incidental to a life but central to it, and who had built hers accordingly. "I'll respect what she put here," Lenora said. She wasn't sure exactly who she was saying it to. "She'd have liked you," Bram said from the doorway. He said it simply, not as a comfort, but as an assessment. She didn't have patience for people who apologized for existing. She said it was a waste of everyone's time. "She was right," Lenora said. "She usually was." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'll show you the rest of the house." The rest of the house was not perfect, and she had not expected it to be. 3 years of bachelor maintenance had left certain things at a level she would charitably describe as functional, and she made mental notes as she walked through each room with the same inventory attention she gave to the camp supplies, not with judgment, but with the specific interest of someone who is thinking about what could be done and what would need to be done first. The room at the east end of the second floor had a window that looked out over the valley floor toward the spring. She stood at that window for a moment. The light was late afternoon now, low and golden in the specific way of October light, in a valley that faces the right direction, and the spring was a silver thread of sound from where she stood, present but not intrusive underneath everything. "This room," she said. "It's yours if you want it," he said. "I want it." She turned from the window. I was standing in the doorway of this room too. She noticed he had a habit of door frames, of standing at the boundary of spaces rather than inside them, which she suspected was not timidity, but the long-practiced caution of a man who had learned to give people room. It was a good habit. She found she liked it. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I came to your camp 6 weeks ago because I had nothing left and I needed one meal, and I was too stubborn to lie down in the road and give up." She said it plainly, without softening it or adding distance from it. That was the truth of it. "I didn't come because I had a plan. I didn't come because I saw an opportunity. I came because the smoke was there, and I was walking and stopping felt like dying." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you because what I'm saying yes to now is a different thing," she said. "I want you to know the difference between them. The first yes was survival. This one is—" She paused, finding the word that was accurate rather than the one that was poetic. "This one is a choice. I have other choices. I have enough money to get somewhere else and start something else. And I've proven to myself, and apparently to 32 other people, that I can manage on my own." She looked at him. "I'm choosing this because I want it, not because I need it. That's the difference." Bram was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me that?" he said. "Not asking. I'm genuinely asking. What do you need me to do with that information?" "I need you to know it," she said, "because you're a man who takes responsibility for things, and I don't want you taking responsibility for me in the wrong way. I don't want to be someone you rescued. I wasn't someone you rescued on that first night, and I'm not someone you're rescuing now." He looked at her steadily. "I stopped thinking of you as something to rescue about 12 hours after you arrived," he said. "When I found out you'd fed 32 people while still starving yourself, I understood clearly that the thing I was dealing with was something entirely different from someone who needed rescuing." He paused. "You're the most self-sufficient person I've ever managed, which makes managing you essentially impossible, for the record." "You'll adjust," she said. "Probably not," he said, "but I'll keep trying." She looked at the window, at the valley, and the failing light, and the silver thread of the spring. "Equal terms," she said. "The ranch is yours. But what we build here, the kitchen operation, the travelers, The table I want to set up for people who need to work for their meal instead of beg for it, that's mine. My design, my management, my call on how it runs. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. And the spare lumber, she said. I need it for that extra shelving row before the winter stores come in. I'll have Otis pull it from the barn tomorrow. Tonight, she said. I'd like to get started tonight. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of amusement. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that preceded a smile in a man who had learned to keep smiles for moments that earned them. Tonight, he agreed. Otis, they discovered, had not been asleep in the wagon at all, but had instead spent the 3-day drive composing, in his head, a complete reorganization of the ranch kitchen's storage system, which he presented over supper that first night with the enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting for a proper kitchen to apply his opinions to. Lenora disagreed with approximately half of it and said so directly, and Otis disagreed with her disagreement and said so directly, and Bram ate his supper and looked between them with the expression of a man who has just understood what he has taken on and has decided it is worth it. The spice cabinet goes on the east wall, Lenora said. The east wall gets morning light, Otis said. Heat degrades, not at that intensity in October through March. In summer I'll move it, but east wall for winter. Otis made the face. The full-force version, the one that had cowed camp riders for 11 years. Lenora looked at it with complete composure. East wall, she said. Fine, he said. Bram put his fork down. Is this what it's going to be like? Yes, they both said simultaneously, and then looked at each other, and something happened between them that was not warmth exactly, but was its structural equivalent, the recognition of people who operate at the same speed and by the same standards, and have found each other across a considerable stretch of difficult country. Good, Bram said, and picked up his fork again. The winter at Cedar Lantern was not easy, and had not been advertised as easy. The first snowfall came in November, earlier than usual, and the kitchen became the center of the ranch in the way that kitchens in cold weather become centers. The room where the warmth was, where the work happened, where people drifted when the outdoor work paused, and the need for something hot and good and human became urgent. Lenora built her table in December. Not literally built it. She was capable of it, but the ranch carpenter was faster and more precise. But she designed it, the long table that sat in the extended kitchen space, the one she had asked Bram for in the 3rd week of November when she had worked out exactly how she wanted the room to function. The table could seat 12. She had considered 10 and settled on 12 because 10 felt like a limitation and 12 felt like an invitation. The rule was simple, not a posted rule, not a formal policy, just the way it worked, communicated by word and by practice. Travelers who came through Cedar Lantern Valley and had money paid the going rate for a meal and a night's lodging. Travelers who did not have money could earn both through honest work, a morning of splitting wood, a half day of fence mending, whatever the ranch needed. Nobody was assessed for why they didn't have money. Nobody was turned away because the work couldn't be found. The first person to earn a meal at that table was a woman about Lenora's age who arrived in January with a child of 4 and a carpet bag that contained, as far as Lenora could tell, everything she owned. She had been traveling from somewhere she was not specific about to somewhere she was not yet sure of, which was a description Lenora recognized from the inside. She gave the woman a room, and she gave the child warm milk, and she put them both to bed without asking for the work first. Because the child was 4, and the woman was past the point where dignity needed testing. In the morning, when they came down, the woman stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "What do you need done?" "Bread," Lenora said. "Can you make bread?" "I was making bread at 6 years old." "Then make bread," Lenora said. "I'll show you where everything is." They made bread together in the Cedar Lantern kitchen that January morning. 2 women who had arrived in difficult circumstances at a place that had a door open and a fire going. And the bread was good, not identical, because they each had their own way of doing it, their own hand in it. And Lenora did not try to correct the woman's way toward her own, because a different hand in bread is not a mistake. It's just different bread, and both kinds feed people. Bram came in from the morning barn work and stood in the kitchen doorway, his doorframe habit unchanged, and looked at the 2 of them and the bread and the child sitting on the extra crate by the work table, eating a biscuit with the focused contentment of a 4-year-old who has been given something warm. He looked at Lenora. She looked at him. "There's coffee," she said. I can see that, he said. He came in and poured himself a cup and sat down at the long table, and the morning continued. Spring came late that year, which was normal for that part of the country. The cattle that Bram had wintered on the valley grass came through it in reasonable shape. Not perfect shape, because no winter on the northern range produced perfect shape, but the kind of shape that meant the spring work could start from a solid foundation rather than a deficit. Otis planted a kitchen garden in April. He did it without consulting Lenora, which she discovered when she came out one morning to find him on his knees in the south-facing plot outside the kitchen door, seeds and his own arcane system of markers arranged around him. She stood in the kitchen doorway. She had developed her own doorframe habit, she noticed, and looked at what he was doing. "What's in the east corner?" she said. "Peppers," he said without looking up. "The dried ones you like. Figured I'd try for fresh." She looked at the east corner. The soil there was particularly dark, particularly good. "You'll need to stake them," she said. "I know how to stake peppers," he said. You've never grown them." "I've never been wrong about a plant either," he said, which was not entirely accurate but was Otis's version of optimism, and she did not argue with it. She went back to the kitchen. The trail hand started coming through in May, the beginning of the drive season, and Cedar Lantern Valley was on the route that several outfits used, and Bram's reputation for fair dealing and Otis's reputation for a kitchen that produced real food brought people through who might otherwise have bypassed the valley. Some of them recognized Lenora. Most of them had heard of her, which was different from recognizing her but amounted to the same practical outcome. They arrived prepared to respect the cook. Several of them told the story of the wildfire as they had heard it, with variations that had developed in the telling, in the way that stories develop. In most versions, she had been braver or more dramatic than she had actually been. In one version, which came through with a crew from Abilene, she had apparently driven a burning wagon into the path of the fire. She corrected this version. "I soaked blankets and burned a strip of grass," she said. "It worked. It also could have not worked." "How'd you know it would work?" the writer who told the story said. "I didn't," she said. "I knew it was the only thing that had a chance." He looked at her. "That's the part they leave out of the story," he said. "That's the part most worth knowing," she said. In June, Bram asked her to build a life with him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not do it with speeches or on his knees or with anything that had been planned for effect, because he was not built for those things, and she would have been made uncomfortable by them. And he knew that because he had been paying attention for 8 months. He did it in the kitchen, in the evening, after supper had been cleared and the ranch was quiet, and she was writing in the inventory book she kept for the kitchen supplies. The same methodical inventory accounting she'd been doing since the first night on the trail, now expanded to cover a ranch kitchen's worth of material. He sat across the table from her and looked at her writing in the inventory book for a moment. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Permanently. As my wife, if that's something you'd consider. If it's not, I'd like you to stay anyway, as my partner in running this place, because the valley works better with you in it, and I am not interested in pretending otherwise." He paused. "But I'd prefer the first option, if it's available." She put down the pencil. She looked at the inventory book. At the numbers she'd been writing, the careful accounting of what was in the kitchen and what it needed, the ledger of sufficiency. She thought about Thomas, and she felt the missing, which was still present, but which had changed shape over the winter and the spring into something that was not an open wound anymore, but a scar. Permanent, part of her, but not preventing movement. She thought about the woman who had walked out of the Nebraska flat toward a campfire because stopping felt like dying. She thought about what it meant to choose something because you wanted it, not because you needed it. "I told you," she said, "that this was a choice and not a survival." "I remember," he said. "I want you to know that's still true," she said. 8 months in, after a winter and a spring and 37 travelers at that table, and Otis's peppers, which are doing extremely well despite the fact that I wasn't sure about them. She looked up at him. "I am not here because I have nowhere else to go. I am here because I choose to be here." "I know," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes?" he said. "Yes," she said again. He nodded, once, and then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way people touch each other when they are confirming something rather than performing something. And then he picked up the coffee cup she'd poured him 20 minutes ago that he hadn't touched yet because it had gone cold. "This is cold," he said. "I know," she said. I poured it 20 minutes ago. You should have drunk it. I was composing myself, he said. You were nervous, she said. Considerably, he said. She got up and took his cup and poured him a fresh one. He watched her do it with the expression she had come to know best on him. Not the trail boss expression, not the accountant expression, but the one underneath those, the one that was just Bram, present and paying attention, and glad of what he was paying attention to. The table's got room for 2 more seats, she said, setting the cup in front of him. I've been thinking about it. 12 is fine, but 14 would be better. I'll have the carpenter out next week, he said. I can tell him the dimensions, she said. Otis will have opinions. Otis always has opinions? His are usually good, she said. Don't tell him I said that. He already knows, Bram said. She sat down and picked up her pencil. They sat at the long table in the cedar lantern kitchen in the June evening, and the spring ran its constant sound outside the north window, and the kitchen was warm from the day's cooking, and the inventory book lay open to a page that accounted for everything the kitchen held, everything it needed, everything it could provide. And the list was long and solid and full, the kind of list that takes a long time to build from nothing, which is the only way it can be built. At the bottom of the page, in Lenora's particular handwriting, not her mother's slant, but her own, sharper and more compressed, was a note she had written for herself when she set up the table rule in December. No hungry traveler turned away before supper. It was not a policy. It was not a charity. It was just the way the door worked, because she had once arrived starving at a fire in the dark, and the door had been open, and that had been everything. And the only honest response to everything is to become, eventually, the person who holds the door. Outside, the summer evening settled over Cedar Lantern Valley. The cattle moved on the valley floor with the slow, patient certainty of animals that know their ground. The spring ran over its limestone in the north, constant and unhurried. The kitchen garden along the south wall had its peppers staked and growing in the particular determined way of things that have found the right soil. Lenora Whitcomb had arrived at Red Willow Cattle Camp with a dented pot, a faded card, and nothing else. She had not arrived at Cedar Lantern Valley with nothing else. She had arrived with everything she'd built since then, with the river crossing and the burnt grass and 32 men who had stood beside her in a boarding house parlor, and the knowledge, earned at considerable cost, that survival is not the destination. Survival is the road. What you build on the other end of it, with whatever you have left, with whoever turns out to be walking the same direction, that is the thing that survival was for. The inventory book lay open on the table. The spring ran outside. The door was unlocked.